Chapter 15 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After such a victory, one felt in a mood for Christmas festivities, for music and dancing, and all beautiful and happy things. Such a thing, for instance, as Mrs. Winnie, when she came to meet him, clad in her best automobile coat, a thing of purest snowy ermine, so truly gorgeous that wherever she went, people turned and stared and caught their breath. Mrs. Winnie was a picture of joyful health, with a glow in her rich complexion and a sparkle in her black eyes. She sat in her big touring car, in which one could afford to wear ermine. It was a little private self-moving hotel. In the limousine were seats for 6 persons, with revolving easy chairs, and berths for sleeping, and a writing desk, and a washstand, and a beautiful electric chandelier to light it at night. Its trimmings were of South American mahogany, and its upholstering of Spanish and Morocco leathers. It had a telephone with which one spoke to the driver, an ice-box, and a lunch hamper. In fact, one might have spent an hour discovering new gimcracks in this magic automobile. It had been made especially for Mrs. Winnie a couple of years ago, and the newspaper said it had cost $30,000. It had then been quite a novelty, but now everybody was getting them. In this car one might sit at ease, and laugh and chat and travel at the rate of an express train, and with never a jar or a quiver, nor the faintest sound of any sort. The streets of the city sped by them as if by enchantment. They went through the park, and out Riverside Drive, and up the river road which runs out of Broadway all the way to Albany. It was a macadamized avenue, lined with beautiful and stately homes. As one went farther yet, he came to the great country estates, a whole district of hundreds of square miles given up to them. There were forests and lakes and streams. There were gardens and greenhouses filled with rare plants and flowers, and parks with deer browsing, and peacocks and lyre birds strutting about. The road wound in and out among hills, the surface of which would become one unbroken lawn, and upon the highest points stood palaces of every conceivable style and shape. One might find these great domains anywhere around the city, at a distance of from 30 to 60 miles. There were 200 or 300 of them, and incredible were the sums of money which had been spent upon their decoration. One saw an artificial lake of 10,000 acres, made upon land which had cost several $100s an acre. One saw gardens with 10,000 rose bushes and $250,000 worth of lilies from Japan. There was one estate in which had been planted $1 million worth of rare trees, imported from all over the world. Some rich men, who had nothing else to amuse them, would make their estates over and over again, changing the view about their homes as one changes the scenery in a play. Over in New Jersey the Hagans were building a castle upon a mountain top, and had built a special railroad simply to carry the materials. Here also was the estate of the Tobacco King, upon which $3 million had been spent before the plans of the mansion had ever been drawn. There were artificial lakes and streams, and fantastic bridges and statuary, and scores of little model plantations and estates, according to the whim of the owner. And here in Pocanto Hills was the estate of the Oil King, about 4 square miles, with 30 miles of model driveways. Many carloads of rare plants had been imported for its gardens, and it took 600 men to keep it in order. There was a golf course, a little miniature Alps, upon which the richest man in the world pursued his lost health, with armed guards and detectives patrolling the place all day, and a tower with a searchlight whereby at night he could flood the grounds with light by pressing a button. In one of these places lived the heir of the great house of Devon. His cousin dwelt in Europe, saying that America was not a fit place for a gentleman to live in. Each of them owned $100 million worth of New York real estate, and drew their tributes of rents from the toil of the swarming millions of the city. And always, according to the policy of the family, they bought new real estate. They were directors of the great railroads tributary to the city, and in touch with the political machines, and in every other way in position to know what was under way. If a new subway were built to set the swarming millions free, the millions would find the land all taken up and apartment houses newly built for them. And the Devons were the owners. They had a score of the city's greatest hotels, and also slum tenements, and brothels, and dives in the Tenderloin. They did not even have to know what they owned. They did not have to know anything or do anything. They lived in their palaces, at home or abroad, and in their offices in the city the great rent-gathering machine ground on. Eldridge Devon's occupation was playing with his country place and his automobiles. He had recently sold all his horses, and turned his stables into a garage equipped with a score or so of cars. He was always getting a new one and discussing its merits. As to Hudson Cliff, the estate, he had conceived the brilliant idea of establishing a gentleman's country place, which should be self-supporting, that is to say, which should furnish the luxuries and necessities of its owner's table for no more than it would have cost to buy them. Considering the prices usually paid, this was no astonishing feat, but Devon took a child's delight in it. He showed Montague his greenhouses, filled with rare flowers and fruits, and his model dairy, with marble stables and nickel plumbing, and attendants in white uniforms and rubber gloves. He was a short and very stout gentleman with red cheeks, and his conversation was not too brilliant. To Hudson Cliff came many of Montague's earlier acquaintances, and others whom he had not met before. They amused themselves in all the ways with which he had become familiar at house parties. Likewise, on Christmas Eve there were festivities for the children, and on Christmas night a costume ball, very beautiful and stately. Many came from New York to attend this, and others from the neighborhood, and in returning calls Montague saw others of these hilltop mansions. Also, and most important of all, they played bridge, as they had played at every function which he had attended so far. Here Mrs. Winnie, who had rather taken him up, and threatened to supplant Oliver as his social guide and chaperone, insisted that no more excuses would be accepted. So for 2 mornings he sat with her in one of the sun parlors, and diligently put his mind upon the game. As he proved an apt pupil, he was then advised that he might take a trial plunge. And so Montague came into touch with a new social phenomenon. Perhaps on the whole the most significant and soul-disturbing phenomenon which society had exhibited to him. He had just had the experience of getting a great deal of money without earning it, and was fresh from the disagreeable memories of it, the trembling and suspense, the burning, lustful greed, the terrible, nerve-devouring excitement. He had hoped that he would not soon have to go through such an experience again, and here was the prospect of an endless dalliance with it. For that was the meaning of bridge. It was a penalty which people were paying for getting their money without earning it. The disease got into their blood, and they could no longer live without the excitement of gain and the hope of gain. Soon after their labors were over, when they were supposed to be resting and enjoying themselves, they would get together and torment themselves with an imitation struggle, mimicking the grim and dreadful gamble of business. Down in the street, Oliver had pointed out to his brother a celebrated plunger who had sometimes won 6 or 8 millions in a single day, and that man would play at stocks all morning and play the ponies in the afternoon, and then spend the evening in a millionaire's gambling house. And so it was with the bridge fiends. It was a social plague. It had run through all society, high and low. It had destroyed conversation and all good fellowship. It would end by destroying even common decency and turning the best people into vulgar gamblers. Thus spoke Mrs. Billy Alden, who was one of the guests, and Montague thought that Mrs. Billy ought to know, for she herself was playing all the time. Mrs. Billy did not like Mrs. Winnie Duval, and the beginnings of the conversation was her inquiry why he had let that woman corrupt him. Then the good lady went on to tell him what bridge had come to be, how people played it on the trains all the way from New York to San Francisco, how they had tables in their autos, and played while they were touring over the world. Once, said she, I took a party to see the America's Cup races off Sandy Hook, and when we got back to the pier, someone called, "Who won?" And the answer was, "Mrs. Billy's ahead, but we're going on this evening." I took a party of friends through the Mediterranean and up the Nile, and we passed Venice and Cairo and the Pyramids and the Suez Canal, and they never once looked up. They were playing bridge. And you think I'm joking, but I mean just literally what I say. I know a man who was traveling from New York to Philadelphia, and got into a game with some strangers, and rode all the way to Palm Beach to finish it. Montague heard later of a well-known society leader who was totally incapacitated that winter from too much bridge at Newport, and she was passing the winter at Hot Springs and Palm Beach and playing bridge there. They played it even in sanitariums, to which they had been driven by nervous breakdown. It was an occupation so exhausting to the physique of women that physicians came to know the symptoms of it, and before they diagnosed a case they would ask, "Do you play bridge?" It had destroyed the last remnants of the Sabbath. It was a universal custom to have card parties on that day. It was a very expensive game, as they played it in society. One might easily win or lose several $1,000s in an evening, and there were many who could not afford this. If one did not play, he would be dropped from the lists of those invited, and when one entered a game, etiquette required him to stay in until it was finished. So one heard of young girls who had pawned their family plate or had sold their honor to pay their bills at the game, and all society knew of one youth who had robbed his hostess of her jewels and pawned them, and then taken her the tickets, telling her that her guests had robbed him. There were women received in the best society who lived as adventuresses, pure and simple, upon their skill at the game. Hostesses would invite rich guests and fleece them. Montague never forgot the sense of amazement and dismay with which he listened while first Mrs. Winnie and then his brother warned him that he must avoid playing with a certain aristocratic dame, whom he met in this most aristocratic household, because she was such a notorious cheater. "My dear fellow," laughed his brother when he protested, "we have a phrase to cheat at cards like a woman." And then Oliver went on to tell him of his own first experience at cards in society, when he had played poker with several charming young debutantes. They would call their hands and take the money without showing their cards, and he had been too gallant to ask to see them. But later he learned that this was a regular practice, and so he never played poker with women. And Oliver pointed out one of these girls to his brother, sitting as beautiful as a picture and as cold as marble, with a half-smoked cigarette on the edge of the table, and a whiskey and soda and glasses of cracked ice beside her. Later on, as he chanced to be reading a newspaper, his brother leaned over his shoulder and pointed out another of the symptoms of the craze, an advertisement headed, "Your Luck Will Change." It gave notice that at Rosenstein's parlors, just off Fifth Avenue, one might borrow money upon expensive gowns and furs. All during the 10 days of this house party, Mrs. Winnie devoted herself to seeing that Montague had a good time. Mrs. Winnie sat beside him at table. He found that somehow a convention had been established which assigned him to Mrs. Winnie as a matter of course. Nobody said anything to him about it, but knowing how relentlessly the affairs of other people were probed and analyzed, he began to feel exceedingly uncomfortable. There came a time when he felt quite smothered by Mrs. Winnie, and immediately after lunch one day he broke away and went for a long walk by himself. This was the occasion of his meeting with an adventure. An inch or two of snow had fallen and lay gleaming in the sunlight. The air was keen, and he drank deep draughts of it, and went striding away over the hills for an hour or so. There was a gale blowing, and as he came over the summits it would strike him, and he would see the river white with foam. And then down in the valleys again all would be still. Here, in a thickly wooded place, Montague's attention was arrested suddenly by a peculiar sound, a heavy thud, which seemed to shake the earth. It suggested a distant explosion, and he stopped for a moment, and then went on, gazing ahead. He passed a turn, and then he saw a great tree which had fallen directly across the road. He went on, thinking that this was what he had heard. But as he came nearer, he saw his mistake. Beyond the tree lay something else, and he began to run toward it. It was two wheels of an automobile sticking up into the air. He sprang upon the tree trunk, and in one glance he saw the whole story. A big touring car had swept round a sharp turn, and swerved to avoid the unexpected obstruction, and so turned a somersault into the ditch. Montague gave a thrill of horror, for there was the form of a man pinned beneath the body of the car. He sprang toward it, but a second glance made him stop. He saw that blood had gushed from the man's mouth and soaked the snow all about. His chest was visibly crushed flat. His eyes were dreadful, half started from their sockets. For a moment Montague stood staring, as if turned to stone. Then from the other side of the car came a moan, and he ran toward the sound. A second man lay in the ditch, moving feebly. Montague sprang to help him. The man wore a heavy bearskin coat. Montague lifted him, and saw that he was a very elderly person, with a cut across his forehead and a face as white as chalk. The other helped him to a position with his back against the bank, and he opened his eyes and groaned. Montague knelt beside him, watching his breathing. He had a sense of utter helplessness. There was nothing he could think of to do, save to unbutton the man's coat and keep wiping the blood from his face. "Some whiskey," the stranger moaned. Montague answered that he had none, but the other replied that there was some in the car. The slope of the bank was such that Montague could crawl under and find the compartment with the bottle in it. The old man drank some, and a little color came back to his face. As the other watched him, it came to him that his face was familiar, but he could not place it. "How many were there with you?" Montague asked, and the man answered, "Only one." Montague went over and made certain that the other man, who was obviously the chauffeur, was dead. Then he hurried down the road and dragged some brush into the middle of it, where it could be seen from a distance by any other automobile that came along, after which he went back to the stranger and bound his handkerchief about his forehead to stop the bleeding from the cut. The old man's lips were tightly set, as if he were suffering great pain. "I'm done for," he moaned again and again. "Where are you hurt?" Montague asked. "I don't know," he gasped, "but it's finished me. I know it. It's the last straw." Then he closed his eyes and lay back. "Can't you get a doctor?" he asked. "There are no houses very near," said Montague, "but I can run." "No, no," the other interrupted anxiously. "Don't leave me. Someone will come. Oh, that fool of a chauffeur! Why couldn't he go slow when I told him? That's always the way with them. They're always trying to show off." "The man is dead," said Montague quietly. The other started upon his elbow. "Dead?" he gasped. "Yes," said Montague. "He's under the car." The old man's eyes had started, wild with fright, and he caught Montague by the arm. "Dead?" he said. "Oh, my God! and it might have been me." There was a moment's pause. The stranger caught his breath and whispered again, "I'm done for. I can't stand it. It's too much." Montague had noticed when he lifted the man that he was very frail and slight of build. Now he could feel that the hand that held his arm was trembling violently. It occurred to him that perhaps the man was not really hurt, but that his nerves had been upset by the shock. And he felt certain of this a moment later, when the stranger suddenly leaned forward, clutching him with redoubled intensity and staring at him with wide, horror-stricken eyes. "Do you know what it means to be afraid of death?" he panted. "Do you know what it means to be afraid of death?" Then, without waiting for a reply, he rushed on. "No, no, you can't, you can't. I don't believe any man knows it as I do. Think of it, for 10 years I've never known a minute when I wasn't afraid of death. It follows me around. It won't let me be. It leaps out at me in places like this, and when I can escape it, I can hear it laughing at me, for it knows I can't get away." The old man caught his breath with a choking sob. He was clinging to Montague like a frightened child, and staring with a wild, hunted look upon his face. Montague sat transfixed. "Yes," the other rushed on, "that's the truth, as God hears me. And it is the first time I've ever spoken of it in my life. I have to hide it, because men would laugh at me. They pretend they're not afraid. But I lie awake at night, and it's like a fiend that sits by my bedside. I lie and listen to my own heart. I feel it beating, and I think how weak it is, and what thin walls it has, and what a wretched, helpless thing it is to have your life depend on that. You don't know what that is, I suppose." Montague shook his head. "You're young, you see," said the other. "You have health. Everybody has health except me. And everybody hates me. I haven't got a friend in the world." Montague was quite taken back by the suddenness of this outburst. He tried to stop it, for he felt almost indecent in listening. It was not fair to take a man off his guard like this. But the stranger could not be stopped. He was completely unstrung, and his voice grew louder and louder. "It's every word of it true," he exclaimed wildly, "and I can't stand it any more. I can't stand anything any more. I was young and strong once. I could take care of myself, and I said, 'I'll make money. I'll be master of other men.' But I was a fool. I forgot my health. And now all the money on earth can't do me any good. I'd give $10 million today for a body like any other man's, and this is what I have." He struck his hands against his bosom. "Look at it," he cried hysterically. "This is what I've got to live in. It won't digest any food, and I can't keep it warm. There's nothing right with it. How would you like to lie awake at night and say to yourself that your teeth were decaying and you couldn't help it? Your hair was falling out, and nobody could stop it. You're old and worn out, falling to pieces, and everybody hates you. Everybody's waiting for you to die, so that they can get you out of the way. The doctors come, and they're all humbugs. They shake their heads and use long words. They know they can't do you any good, but they want their big fees. And all they do is to frighten you worse and make you sicker than ever." There was nothing that Montague could do save to sit and listen to this outburst of wretchedness. His attempts to soothe the old man only had the effect of exciting him more. "Why does it have to fall on me?" he moaned. "I want to be like other people. I want to live. And instead I'm like a man with a pack of hungry wolves prowling round him. That's what it's like. It's like nature, hungry and cruel and savage. You think you know what life is. It seems so beautiful and gentle and pleasant. That's when you're on top. But now I'm down, and I know what it is. It's a thing like a nightmare that reaches out for you to clutch you and crush you, and you can't get away from it. You're helpless as a rat in a corner. You're damned! You're damned!" The miserable man's voice broke into a cry of despair, and he sank down in a heap in front of Montague, shaking and sobbing. The other was trembling slightly and stricken with awe. There was a long silence, and then the stranger lifted his tear-stained face, and Montague helped to support him. "Have a little more of the whiskey," said he. "No," the other answered feebly, "I'd better not." "My doctors won't let me have whiskey," he added, after a while. "That's my liver. I've so many don'ts, you know, that it takes a notebook to keep track of them, and all of them together do me no good. Think of it! I have to live on graham crackers and milk. Actually, not a thing has passed my lips for 2 years but graham crackers and milk." And then suddenly, with a start, it came to Montague where he had seen this wrinkled old face before. It was Laura Hegan's uncle, whom the Major had pointed out to him in the dining room of the Millionaires' Club. Old Henry S. Grimes, who was really only 60 but looked 80, and who owned slum tenements and evicted more people in a month than could be crowded into the clubhouse. Montague gave no sign, but sat holding the man in his arms. A trickle of blood came from under the handkerchief and ran down his cheek. Montague felt him tremble as he touched this with his ringer. "Is it much of a cut?" he asked. "Not much," said Montague. 2 or 3 stitches, perhaps." "Send for my family physician," the other added. "If I should faint or anything, you'll find his name in my card case. What's that?" There was the sound of voices down the road. "Hello!" Montague shouted, and a moment later 2 men in automobile costume came running toward him. They stopped, staring in dismay at the sight which confronted them. At Montague's suggestion, they made haste to find a log, by means of which they lifted the auto sufficiently to drag out the body of the chauffeur. Montague saw that it was quite cold. He went back to old Grimes. "Where do you wish to go?" he asked. The other hesitated. "I was bound for the Harrisons," he said. "The Leslie Harrisons?" asked Montague. They were people he had met at the Devons. The other noticed his look of recognition. "Do you know them?" he asked. "I do," said Montague. "If it isn't far," said the old man, "perhaps I'd best go there." And then he hesitated for a moment, and catching Montague by the arm, and pulling him toward him, whispered, "Tell me, you won't tell?" Montague, comprehending what he meant, answered, "It will be between us." At the same time he felt a new thrill of revulsion for this most miserable old creature. They lifted him into the car, and because they delayed long enough to lay a blanket over the body of the chauffeur, he asked peevishly why they did not start. During the 10 or 15 minutes trip he sat clinging to Montague, shuddering with fright every time they rounded a turn in the road. They reached the Harrisons' place, and the footman who opened the door was startled out of his studied impassivity by the sight of a big bundle of bearskin in Montague's arms. "Send for Mrs. Harrison," said Montague, and laid the bundle upon a divan in the hall. "Get a doctor as quickly as you can," he added to a second attendant. Mrs. Harrison came. "It's Mr. Grimes," said Montague, and then he heard a frightened exclamation, and turned and saw Laura Hegan in a walking costume, fresh from the cold outside. "What is it?" she cried, and he told her as quickly as he could, and she ran to help the old man. Montague stood by, and later carried him upstairs and waited below until the doctor came. It was only when he set out for home again that he found time to think about Laura Hegan, and how beautiful she looked in her furs. He wondered if it would always be his fate to meet her under circumstances which left her no time to be aware of his own existence. At home he told about his adventure, and found himself quite a hero for the rest of the day. He was obliged to give interviews to several newspaper reporters, and to refuse to let one of them take his picture. Every one at the Devons seemed to know old Harry Grimes, and Montague thought to himself that if the comments of this particular group of people were a fair sample, the poor wretch was right in saying that he had not a friend in the world. When he came downstairs the next morning, he found elaborate accounts of the accident in the papers, and learned that Grimes had nothing worse than a scalp wound and a severe shock. Even so, he felt it incumbent upon him to pay a visit of inquiry, and rode over shortly before lunch. Laura Hegan came down to see him, wearing a morning gown of white. She confirmed the good news of the papers, and said that her uncle was resting quietly. She did not say that his physician had come post haste, with 2 nurses, and taken up his residence in the house, and that the poor old millionaire was denied even his graham crackers and milk. Instead, she said that he had mentioned Montague's kindness particularly, and asked her to thank him. Montague was cynical enough to doubt this. It was the first time that he had had any occasion to talk with Miss Hegan. He noticed her gentle and caressing voice, with the least touch of the South in it, and he was glad to find that it was possible for her to talk without breaking the spell of her serene and noble beauty. Montague stayed as long as he had any right to stay. And all the way as he rode home, he was thinking about Laura Hegan. Here for the first time was a woman whom he felt he should like to know, a woman with reserve and dignity and some ideas in her life, and it was impossible for him to know her, because she was rich. There was no dodging this fact. Montague did not even try. He had met women with fortunes already, and he knew how they felt about themselves, and how the rest of the world felt about them. They might wish in their hearts to be something else besides the keepers of a treasure chest, but their wishes were futile. The money went with them, and they had to defend it against all comers. Montague recalled one heiress after another, debutantes some of them, exquisite and delicate as butterflies, but under the surface as hard as chain armor. All their lives they had been trained to think of themselves as representing money, and of every one who came near them as adventurers seeking money. In every word they uttered, in every glance and motion, one might read this meaning. And then he thought of Laura Hegan, with the fortune she would inherit, and he pictured what her life must be, the toadies and parasites and flatterers who would lay siege to her, the scheming mammas and the affectionate sisters and cousins who would plot to gain her confidence. For a man who was poor, and who meant to keep his self-respect, was there any possible conclusion except that she was entirely unknowable to him? End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Montague came back to the city, and dug into his books again, while Alice gave her spare hours to watching the progress of the new gown in which she was to uphold the honor of the family at Mrs. Devon's opening ball. The great event was due in the next week, and society was as much excited about it as a family of children before Christmas. All whom Montague met were invited, and all were going, unless they happened to be in mourning. Their gossip was all of the disappointed ones, their bitterness and heart-burning. Mrs. Devon's mansion was thrown open early on the eventful evening, but few would come until midnight. It was the fashion to attend the opera first, and previous to that half a dozen people would give big dinners. He was a fortunate person who did not hear from his liver after this occasion, for at 1 o'clock came Mrs. Devon's massive supper, and then again at 4 o'clock another supper. To prepare these repasts, a dozen extra chefs had been imported into the Devon establishment for a week, for it was part of the great lady's pride to permit no outside caterer to prepare anything for her guests. Montague had never been able to get over this wonder at the social phenomenon known as Mrs. Devon. He came and took his chances in the jostling throngs, and except that he got into casual conversation with one of the numerous detectives whom he took for a guest, he came off fairly well. But all the time that he was being passed about and introduced and danced with, he was looking about him and wondering. The grand staircase and the hall and parlors had been turned into tropical gardens, with palms and trailing vines and azaleas and roses and great vases of scarlet poinsettias, with hundreds of lights glowing through them. It was said that this ball had exhausted the flower supply of the country as far south as Atlanta. And then in the reception room one came upon the little old lady standing beneath a bower of orchids. She was clad in a robe of royal purple trimmed with silver, and girdled about with an armor plate of gems. If one might credit the papers, the diamonds that were worn at one of these balls were valued at $20,000,000. The stranger was quite overwhelmed by all the splendor. There was a cotillion danced by 200 gorgeously clad women and their partners, a scene so gay that one could only think of it as happening in a fairy legend or some old romance of knighthood. 4 sets of favors were given during this function, and jewels and objects of art were showered forth as if from a magician's wand. Mrs. Devon herself soon disappeared, but the riot of music and merrymaking went on till near morning, and during all this time the halls and rooms of the great mansion were so crowded that one could scarcely move about. Then one went home, and realized that all this splendor, and the human effort which it represented, had been for nothing but a memory. Nor would he get the full meaning of it if he failed to realize that it was simply one of thousands, a pattern which every one there would strive to follow in some function of his own. It was a signal bell which told the world that the season was open. It loosed the floodgates of extravagance, and the torrent of dissipation poured forth. From then on there would be a continuous round of gaieties. One might have 3 banquets every single night, for a dinner and 2 suppers was now the custom at entertainments. And filling the rest of one's day were receptions and teas and musicales. A person might take this choice among a score of opportunities, and never leave the circle he met at Mrs. Devon's. Nor was this counting the tens of thousands of aspirants and imitators all over the city, nor in a host of other cities, each with thousands of women who had nothing to do save to ape the ways of the metropolis. The mind could not realize the volume of this deluge of destruction. It was a thing which stunned the senses, and thundered in one's ears like Niagara. The meaning of it all did not stop with the people who poured it forth. Its effects were to be traced through the whole country. There were hordes of tradesmen and manufacturers who supplied what society bought, and whose study it was to induce people to buy as much as possible. And so they devised what were called fashions, little eccentricities of cut and material, which made everything go out of date quickly. There had once been 2 seasons, but now there were 4, and through window displays and millions of advertisements the public was lured into the trap. The yellow journals would give whole pages to describing what the 400 are wearing, and there were magazines with many millions of readers, which existed for nothing save to propagate these ideas. And everywhere, in all classes of society, men and women were starving their minds and hearts, and straining their energies to follow this phantom of fashion. The masses were kept poor because of it, and the youth and hope of the world was betrayed by it. In country villages poor farmers' wives were trimming their bonnets over to be stylish, and servant girls in the cities were wearing imitation sealskins, and shop clerks and seamstresses selling themselves into brothels for the sake of ribbons and gilt jewellery. It was the instinct of decoration, perverted by the money lust. In the metropolis the sole test of excellence was money, and the possession of money was the proof of power, and every natural desire of men and women had been tainted by this influence. The love of beauty, the impulse to hospitality, the joys of music and dancing and love, all these things had become simply means to the demonstration of money power. The men were busy making more money, but their idle women had nothing in life save this mad race in display. So it had come about that the women who could consume wealth most conspicuously, and who was the most effective instrument for the destroying of the labor and lives of other people, this was the woman who was most applauded and most noticed. The most appalling fact about society was this utter blind materialism. Such expectations as Montague had brought with him had been derived from the literature of Europe. In a grand monde such as this, he expected to meet diplomats and statesmen, scientists and explorers, philosophers and poets and painters, but one never heard anything about such people in society. It was a mark of eccentricity to be interested in intellectual affairs, and one might go about for weeks and not meet a person with an idea. When these people read, it was a sugar candy novel, and when they went to the play, it was a musical comedy. The one single intellectual product which it could point to as its own was a rancid scandal sheet, used mainly as a means of blackmail. Now and then some aspiring young matron of the elite would try to set up a salon after the fashion of the continent, and would gather a few feeble wits about her for a time. But for the most part, the intellectual workers of the city held themselves severely aloof, and society was left a little clique of people whose fortunes had become historic in a decade or two, and who got together in each other's palaces and gorged themselves and gambled and gossiped about each other, and wove about their personalities a veil of awful and exclusive majesty. Montague found himself thinking that perhaps it was not they who were to blame. It was not they who had set up wealth as the end and goal of things. It was the whole community, of which they were a part. It was not their fault that they had been left with power and nothing to use it for, and it was not their fault that their sons and daughters found themselves stranded in the world, deprived of all necessity and of the possibility of doing anything useful. The most pitiful aspect of the whole thing to Montague was this second generation, who were coming upon the scene, with their lives all poisoned in advance. No wrong which they could do to the world would ever equal the wrong to which the world had done them, in permitting them to have money which they had not earned. They were cut off forever from reality, and from the possibility of understanding life. They had big, healthy bodies, and they craved experience, and they had absolutely nothing to do. That was the real meaning of all this orgy of dissipation, this social whirl as it was called. It was the frantic chase of some new thrill, some excitement that would stir the senses of people who had nothing in the world to interest them. That was why they were building palaces, and flinging largeness of banquets and balls, and tearing about the country in automobiles, and traveling over the earth in steam yachts and private trains. At first and last, the lesson of their effort was that the chase was futile. The jaded nerves would not thrill. The most conspicuous fact about society was its unutterable and agonizing boredom. Of its great solemn functions the shop girls would read with greedy envy, but the women who attended them would be half asleep behind their jeweled fans. It was typified to Montague by Mrs. Billy Alden's yachting party on the Nile, yawning in the face of the Sphinx, and playing bridge beneath the shadow of the pyramids, and counting the crocodiles, and proposing to jump in by way of changing the pain. People attended these ceaseless rounds of entertainments simply because they dreaded to be left alone. They wandered from place to place, following like a herd of sheep whatever leader would inaugurate a new diversion. One could have filled a volume with the lists of their fads. There were new ones every week. If society did not invent them, the yellow journals invented them. There was a woman who had her teeth filled with diamonds, and another who was driving a pair of zebras. One heard of monkey dinners and pajama dinners at Newport, of horseback dinners and vegetable dances in New York. One heard of fashion albums and autograph fans, and talking crows, and rare orchids and reindeer meat, of bracelets for men and ankle rings for women, of vanity boxes at $10,000 and $20,000 each, of weird and repulsive pets, chameleons and lizards and king snakes. There was one young woman who wore a cat snake as a necklace. One would take to slumming, and another to sniffing brandy through the nose. And one had a table cover made of woven roses, and another was wearing perfumed flannel at $16 a yard. One had inaugurated ice skating in August. Another had started a class for the study of Plato. Some were giving tennis tournaments in bathing suits, and playing leapfrog after dinner. Others had got dispensation from the Pope, so that they might have private chapels and confessors. And yet others were giving progressive dinners, moving from one restaurant to another, a cocktail and blue points at Sherry's, a soup and Madeira at Delmonico's, some terrapin with Amontillado at the Waldorf, and so on. One of the consequences of the furious pace was that people's health broke down very quickly, and there were all sorts of bizarre ways of restoring it. One person would be eating nothing but spinach, and another would be living on grass. One would chew a mouthful of soup 32 times, another would eat every 2 hours, and another only once a week. Some went out early in the morning and walked barefooted in the grass. Others went hopping about the floor on their hands and knees to take off fat. There were rest cures and water cures, and new thought and metaphysical healing, and Christian Science. There was an automatic horse which one might ride indoors, with a register showing the distance traveled. Montague met one man who had an electric machine which cost $30,000, and which took hold of his arms and feet and exercised him while he waited. He met a woman who told him she was riding an electric camel. Everywhere one went, there were new people, spending their money in new and incredible ways. Here was a man who had bought a chapel and turned it into a theater, and hired professional actors and persuaded his friends to come and see him act Shakespeare. Here was a woman who costumed herself after figures in famous paintings, with arrangements of roses and cherry leaves and wreaths of ivy and laurel, and with costumes for her pet dogs to match. Here was a man who paid $6 a day for a carnation 4 inches across, and a girl who wore a hat trimmed with fresh morning glories, and a ball costume with swarms of real butterflies tied with silk threads, and another with a hat made of woven silver, with ostrich plumes 40 inches long, made entirely of silver films. Here was a man who hired a military company to drill all day long to prepare a floor for dancing, and another who put up a building at a cost of $30,000 to give a debutante dance for his daughter, and then had it torn down the day after. Here was a man who bred rattlesnakes and turned them loose by thousands, and had driven everybody away from the North Carolina estate of one of the Wallings. Here was a man was building himself a yacht with a model dairy and bakery on board, and a French laundry and a brass band. Here was $1 million racing yacht with auto boats on it, and a platoon of marksmen, and some Chinese laundrymen, and 2 physicians for its half-insane occupant. Here was a man who had bought a Rhine castle for $750,000, and spent as much in restoring it, and filled it with servants dressed in 14th century costumes. Here was a $5 million art collection hidden away where nobody ever saw it. One saw the meaning of this madness most clearly in the young men of society. Some were killing themselves, and other people in automobile races at 120 miles an hour. Some went in for auto boats, mere shells of things, shaped like a knife blade that tore through the water at 40 miles an hour. Some would hire professional pugilists to knock them out. Others would get up dog fights and bear fights, and boxing matches with kangaroos. Montague was taken to the home of one young man who had given his life to hunting wild game in every corner of the globe, and would travel round the world for a new species to add to his museum of trophies. He had heard that Baron Rothschild had offered £1,000 for a bongo, a huge grass-eating animal which no white man had ever seen, and he had taken a year's trip into the interior, with a train of 130 natives, and had brought out the heads of 40 different species, including a bongo, which the Baron did not get. He met another who had helped to organize a balloon club, and 2 24-hour trips in the clouds. This, by the way, was the latest sport. At Tuxedo they had races between balloons and automobiles, and Montague met one young lady who boasted that she had been up 5 times. There was another young millionaire who sat and patiently taught Sunday school, in the presence of a host of reporters. There was another who set up a chain of newspapers all over the country, and made war upon his class. There were others who went in for settlement work and Russian revolutionists. There were even some who called themselves socialists. Montague thought that this was the strangest fad of all, and when he met one of these young men at an afternoon tea, he gazed at him with wonder and perplexity, thinking of the man he had heard ranting on the street corner. This was the second generation. Appalling as it was to think of, there was a third growing up, and getting ready to take the stage, and with wealth accumulating faster than ever. Who could guess what they might do? There were still in society a few men and women who had earned their money, and had some idea of the toil and suffering that it stood for. But when the third generation had taken possession, these would all be dead or forgotten, and there would no longer be any link to connect them with reality. In light of this thought, one was moved to watch the children of the rich. Some of these had inherited scores of millions of dollars while they were still in the cradle, and now and then one of them would be presented with $1 million house for a birthday gift. When such a baby was born, the newspapers would give pages to describing its layette, and baby dresses at $100 each, and lace handkerchiefs at $5, and dressing sets with tiny gold brushes and powder boxes. One might see a picture of the precious object in a Moses basket, covered with rare and wonderful Valenciennes lace. This child would grow up in an atmosphere of luxury and self-indulgence. It would be bullying the servants at the age of 6, and talking scandal and smoking cigarettes at 12. It would be petted and admired and stared at and paraded about in state, and dressed up like a French doll. It would drink in snobbery and hatefulness with the very air it breathed. One might meet in these great houses little tots, not yet in their teens, whose talk was all of the cost of things and the inferiority of their neighbors. There was nothing in the world too good for them. They had little miniature automobiles to ride about the country in, and blooded Arabian ponies and doll-houses in real Louis Seize, with jeweled rugs and miniature electric lights. At Miss Caroline Smith's, Montague was introduced to a pale and anemic-looking youth of 13, who dined in solemn state alone when the rest of the family was away, and insisted upon having all the footmen in attendance, and his unfortunate aunt brought a storm about her ears by forbidding the butler to take champagne upstairs into the nursery before lunch. A little remark stayed in Montague's mind as expressing the attitude of society towards such matters. Major Venable had chanced to remark jestingly that children were coming to understand so much nowadays that it was necessary for the ladies to be careful, to which Mrs. Vivie Patton answered with a sudden access of seriousness, "I don't know. Do you find that children have any morals? Mine haven't." And then the fascinating Mrs. Vivie went on to tell the truth about her own children. They were natural-born savages, and that was all there was to it. They did as they pleased, and no one could stop them. The Major replied that nowadays all the world was doing as it pleased, and no one seemed able to stop it. And with that jest the conversation was turned to other matters. But Montague sat in silence, thinking about it, wondering what would happen to the world when it had fallen under the sway of this generation of spoiled children, and had adopted altogether the religion of doing as one pleased. In the beginning, people had simply done as they pleased spontaneously, and without thinking about it, but now Montague discovered the custom had spread to such an extent that it was developing a philosophy. There was springing up a new cult, whose devotees were planning to make over the world upon the plan of doing as one pleased. Because its members were wealthy and able to command the talent of the world, the cult was developing an art with a highly perfected technique, and a literature which was subtle and exquisite and alluring. Europe had had such a literature for a century, and England for a generation or two, and now America was having it too. Montague had an amusing insight into this one day, when Mrs. Vivie invited him to one of her artistic evenings. Mrs. Vivie was in touch with a special set which went in for intellectual things, and included some amateur bohemians and men of genius. "Don't you come if you'll be shocked," she had said to him, "for Strathcona will be there." Montague deemed himself able to stand a good deal by this time. He went and found Mrs. Vivie and her count. Mr. Vivie had apparently not been invited, and also the young poet of diabolism, whose work was just then the talk of the town. He was a tall, slender youth, with a white face and melancholy black eyes, and black locks falling in cascades about his ears. He sat in an oriental corner, with a manuscript copied in tiny handwriting upon delicately scented art paper, and tied with passionate purple ribbons. A young girl, clad in white, sat by his side and held a candle, while he read from this manuscript his unprinted, because unprintable, verses. And between the readings the young poet talked. He talked about himself and his work. Apparently that was what he had come to talk about. His words flowed like a swift stream, limpid, sparkling, incessant, leaping from place to place, here, there, quick as the play of light upon the water. Montague labored to follow the speaker's ideas, until he found his mind in a whirl and gave it up. Afterward, when he thought it over, he laughed at himself, for Strathcona's ideas were not serious things, having relationship to truth. They were epigrams put together to dazzle the hearers, studies in paradox with as much relation to life as fireworks. He took the sum total of the moral experience of the human race and turned it upside down and jumbled it about and used it as a bit of glass in a kaleidoscope, and the hearers would gasp and whisper, "Diabolical!" The motto of this school of poets was that there was neither good nor evil, but that all things were interesting. After listening to Strathcona for half an hour, one felt like hiding his head and denying that he had ever thought of having any virtue, in a world where all things were uncertain. It was presumptuous even to pretend to know what virtue was. One could only be what one was, and did not that mean that one must do as one pleased? You could feel a shudder run through the company at his audacity, and the worst of it was that you could not dismiss it with a laugh, for the boy was really a poet. He had fire and passion, the gift of melodious ecstasy. He was only 20, and in his brief meteor flight he had run the gamut of all experience. He had familiarized himself with all human achievement, past, present, and future. There was nothing anyone could mention that he did not perfectly comprehend. The rapture of the saints, the consecration of the martyrs, yes, he had known them. Likewise, he had touched the depths of depravity. He had been lost in the innermost passages of the caverns of hell. And all this had been interesting. In its time, now he was sighing for new worlds of experience, save for the unrequited love which should drive him to madness. It was at this point that Montague dropped out of the race, and took to studying from the outside the mechanism of this young poet's conversation. Strathcona flouted the idea of a moral sense, but in reality he was quite dependent upon it. His recipe for making epigrams was to take what other people's moral sense made them respect, and identify it with something which their moral sense made them abhor. Thus, for instance, the tale which he told about one of the members of his set, who was a relative of a bishop. The great man had occasion to rebuke him for his profligate ways, declaring in the course of his lecture that he was living off the reputation of his father. To which the boy made the crushing rejoinder, "It may be bad to live off the reputation of one's father, but it is better than living off the reputation of God." This was very subtle, and it was necessary to ponder it. God was dead, and the worthy bishop did not know it. But let him take a new God, who had no reputation, and go out into the world and make a living out of him. Then Strathcona discussed literature. He paid his tribute to the Fleurs de Mal and the Songs before Sunrise, but most, he said, he owed to the divine Oscar. This English poet, of many poses and some vices the law had seized and flung into jail, and since the law is a thing so brutal and wicked that whoever is touched by it is made thereby a martyr and a hero, there had grown up quite a cult about the memory of Oscar. All up-to-date poets imitated his style and his attitude to life, and so most of them, revolting of vices, had the cloak of romance flung about them, were given long Greek and Latin names, and discussed with parade of learning as revivals of Hellenic ideals. The young men in Strathcona's set referred to each other as their lovers, and if one showed any perplexity over this, he was regarded, not with contempt, for it was not aesthetic to feel contempt, but with a slight lifting of the eyebrows, intended to annihilate. One must not forget, of course, that these young people were poets, and to that extent were protected from their own doctrines. They were interested, not in life, but in making pretty verses about life. There was some among them who lived his cheerful aesthetics in garret rooms, and gave melodious expression to devilish emotions. But on the other hand, for every poet, there were thousands who were not poets, but people to whom life was real. And these lived out the creed and wrecked their lives, and with the aid of the poet's magic, the glamour of melody, and the fire divine, they wrecked the lives with which they came into contact. The new generation of boys and girls were deriving their spiritual sustenance from the poetry of Baudelaire and Wilde, and rushing with the hot impulsiveness of youth into the dreadful traps which the traders in vice prepared for them. One's heart bled to see them, pink-cheeked and bright-eyed, pursuing the hem of the Muse's robe in brothels and dens of infamy. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The social mill ground on for another month. Montague withdrew himself as much as his brother would let him, but Alice was on the go all night and half the day. Oliver had sold his racing automobile to a friend. He was a man of family now, he said, and his wild days were over. He had got instead a limousine car for Alice, though she declared she had no need of it. If ever she was going to any place, Charlie Carter always begged her to use his. Charlie's siege was as persistent as ever, as Montague noticed with annoyance. The great law case was going forward. After weeks of study and investigation, Montague felt that he had the matter well in hand, and he had taken Mr. Hasbrook's memoranda as a basis for a new work of his own, much more substantial. Bit by bit, as he dug into the subject, he had discovered a state of affairs in the Fidelity Company, and indeed in the whole insurance business and its allied realms of banking and finance, which shocked him profoundly. It was impossible for him to imagine how such conditions could exist and remain unknown to the public, more especially as every one in Wall Street with whom he talked seemed to know about them and to take them for granted. His client's papers had provided him with references to the books. Montague had taken this dry material and made of it a protest which had a breath of life in it. It was a thing at which he toiled with deadly earnestness. It was not merely a struggle of one man to get a few $1,000s. It was an appeal in behalf of millions of helpless people whose trust had been betrayed. It was the first step in a long campaign, which the young lawyer meant should force a great evil into the light of day. He went over his bill of complaint with Mr. Hasbrook, and he was glad to see that the work he had done made its impression upon him. In fact, his client was a little afraid that some of his arguments might be too radical in tone, from the strictly legal point of view, he made haste to explain, but Montague reassured him upon this point. And then came the day when the great ship was ready for launching. The news must have spread quickly, for a few hours after the papers in the suit had been filed, Montague received a call from a newspaper reporter, who told him of the excitement in financial circles, where the thing had fallen like a bomb. Montague explained the purpose of the suit, and gave the reporter a number of facts which he felt certain would attract attention to the matter. When he picked up the paper the next morning, however, he was surprised to find that only a few lines had been given to the case, and that his interview had been replaced by one with an unnamed official of the Fidelity, to the effect that the attack upon the company was obviously for blackmailing purposes. That was the only ripple which Montague's work produced upon the surface of the pool, but there was a great commotion among the fish at the bottom, about which he was soon to learn. That evening, while he was hard at work in his study, he received a telephone call from his brother. "I'm coming round to see you," said Oliver. "Wait for me." "All right," said the other, and added, "I thought you were dining at the Wallings'." "I'm there now," was the answer. "I'm leaving." "What's the matter?" Montague asked. "There's hell to pay," was the reply, and then silence. When Oliver appeared a few minutes later, he did not even stop to set down his hat, but exclaimed, "Allan, what in heaven's name have you been doing?" "What do you mean?" asked the other. "Why, that suit. "What about it?" "Good God, man!" cried Oliver. "Do you mean that you really don't know what you've done?" Montague was staring at him. "I'm afraid I don't," said he. "Why, you're turning the world upside down!" exclaimed the other. "Everybody you know is crazy about it." "Everybody I know?" echoed Montague. "What have they to do with it?" "Why, you've stabbed them in the back!" half shouted Oliver. "I could hardly believe my ears when they told me. Robbie Walling is simply wild. I never had such a time in my life." "I don't understand yet," said Montague, more and more amazed. "What has he to do with it?" "Why, man," cried Oliver, "his brother's a director in the Fidelity, and his own interests, and all the other companies. You've struck at the whole insurance business." Montague caught his breath. "Oh, I see," he said. "How could you think of such a thing?" cried the other wildly. "You promised to consult me about things." "I told you when I took this case," put in Montague quickly. "I know," said his brother, "but you didn't explain. And what did I know about it? I thought I could leave it to your common sense not to mix up in a thing like this." "I'm very sorry," said Montague gravely. "I had no idea of any such result." "That's what I told Robbie," said Oliver. "Good God, what a time I had!" He took his hat and coat and laid them on the bed, and sat down and began to tell about it. "I made him realize the disadvantage you were under," he said, "being a stranger and not knowing the ground. I believe he had an idea that you tried to get his confidence on purpose to attack him. It was Mrs. Robbie, I guess. You know her fortune is all in that quarter." Oliver wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "My," he said, "and fancy what old Wyman must be saying about this, and what a time poor Betty must be having. And then Freddie Van Dam, the air will be blue for half-mile round his place. I must send him a wire and explain that it was a mistake, and that we're getting out of it." And he got up, to suit the action to the word. But halfway to the desk he heard his brother say, "Wait." He turned, and saw Montague quite pale. "I suppose by getting out of it," said the latter, "you mean dropping the case?" "Of course," was the answer. "Well then," he continued very gravely, "I can see that it's going to be hard, and I'm sorry. But you might as well understand me at the very beginning. I will never drop this case." Oliver's jaw fell limp. "Allan!" he gasped. There was a silence, and then the storm broke. Oliver knew his brother well enough to realize just how thoroughly he meant what he said, and so he got the full force of the shock all at once. He raved and swore and wrung his hands, and declaimed at his brother, saying that he had betrayed him, that he was ruining him, dumping himself and the whole family into the ditch. They would be jeered at and insulted. They would be blacklisted and thrown out of society. Alice's career would be cut short. Every door would be closed to her. His own career would die before it was born. He would never get into the clubs. He would be a pariah. He would be bankrupted and penniless. Again and again Oliver went over the situation, naming person after person who would be outraged, and describing what that person would do. There were the Wallings and the Venables and the Havens, and the Van Dams and the Todds and the Wymans. They were all one regiment, and Montague had flung a bomb into the center of them. It was very terrible to him to see his brother's rage and despair, but he had seen his way clear through this matter, and he knew that there was no turning back for him. "It is painful to learn that all one's acquaintances are thieves," he said, "but that does not change my opinion of stealing." "But my God!" cried Oliver, "did you come to New York to preach sermons?" To which the other answered, "I came to practice law, and the lawyer who will not fight injustice is a traitor to his profession." Oliver threw up his hands in despair. What could one say to a sentiment such as that? But then again he came to the charge, pointing out to his brother the position in which he had placed himself with the Wallings. He had accepted their hospitality. They had taken him and Alice in, and done everything in the world for them, things for which no money could ever repay them. And now he had struck them. But the only effect of that was to make Montague regret that he had ever anything to do with the Wallings. If they expected to use their friendship to tie his hands in such a matter, they were people he would have left alone. "But do you realize that it's not merely yourself you're ruining?" cried Oliver. "Do you know what you're doing for Alice?" "That is harder yet for me," the other replied. "But I am sure that Alice will not ask me to stop." Montague was firmly set in his own mind, but it seemed to be quite impossible for his brother to realize that this was the case. He would give up, but then, going back into his own mind, and facing the thought of this person and that, and the impossibility of the situation which would arise, he would return to the attack with new anguish in his voice. He implored and scolded, and even wept, and then he would get himself together again, and come and sit in front of his brother and try to reason with him. And so it was that in the small hours of the morning, Montague, pale and nervous, but quite unshaken, was sitting and listening while his brother unfolded before him a picture of the Metropolis as he had come to see it. It was a city ruled by mighty forces, money forces, great families and fortunes, which had held their sway for generations, and regarded the place, with all its swarming millions, as their birthright. They had possessed it utterly. They held it in the hollow of their hands. Railroads and telegraphs and telephones, banks and insurance and trust companies, all these they owned, and the political machines and the legislatures and the courts and the newspapers, the churches and the colleges, and their rule was for plunder. All the streams of profit ran into their coffers. The stranger who came to their city succeeded as he helped them in their purpose, and failed if they could not use him. A great editor or bishop was a man who taught their doctrines. A great statesman was a man who made the laws for them. A great lawyer was one who helped them to outwit the public. Any man who dared to oppose them, they would cast out and trample on. They would slander and ridicule and ruin. And Oliver came down to particulars. He named these powerful men, one after one, and showed what they could do. If his brother would only be a man of the world, and see the thing. Look at all the successful lawyers. Oliver named them, one after one. Shrewd devisers of corporation trickery, with incomes of hundreds of thousands a year. He could not name the men who had refused to play the game, for no one had ever heard of them. But it was so evident what would happen in this case. His friends would cast him off. His own client would get his price, whatever it was, and then leave him in the lurch, and laugh at him. "If you can't make up your mind to play the game," cried Oliver frantically, "at least you can give it up. There are plenty of other ways of getting a living. If you'll let me, I'll take care of you myself, rather than have you disgrace me. Tell me, will you do that? Will you quit altogether?" And Montague suddenly leaped to his feet and brought his fist down upon the desk with a bang. "No!" he cried. "By God, no! Let me make you understand me once and for all," he rushed on. "You've shown me New York as you see it. I don't believe it's the truth. I don't believe it for one single moment. But let me tell you this. I shall stay here and find out, and if it is true, it won't stop me. I shall stay here and defy those people. I shall stay and fight them till the day I die. They may ruin me. I'll go live in a garret if I have to. But as sure as there's a God that made me, I'll never stop till I've opened the eyes of the people to what they're doing." Montague towered over his brother, white-hot and terrible. Oliver shrank from him. He had never seen such a burst of wrath from him before. "Do you understand me now?" Montague cried, and he answered in a despairing voice, "Yes, yes." "I see it's all up," he added weakly. "You and I can't pull together." "No," exclaimed the other, passionately, "we can't. And we might as well give up trying. You have chosen to be a time server and a lickspittle, and I don't choose it. Do you think I've learned nothing in the time I've been here? Why, man, you used to be daring and clever, and now you never draw a breath without wondering if these rich snobs will like the way you do it. And you want Alice to sell herself to them, and you want me to sell my career to them." There was a long pause. Oliver had turned very pale, and then suddenly his brother caught himself together and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to quarrel, but you've goaded me too much. I'm grateful for what you have tried to do for me, and I'll pay you back as soon as I can. But I can't go on with this game. I'll quit, and you can disown me to your friends, and tell them that I've run amuck and to forget they ever knew me. They'll hardly blame you for it. They know you too well for that. And as for Alice, I'll talk it out with her tomorrow, and let her decide for herself. If she wants to be a society queen, she can put herself in your hands, and I'll get out of her way. On the other hand, if she approves of what I am doing, why, we'll both quit, and you won't have to bother with either of us." That was the basis upon which they parted for the night. But like most resolutions taken at white heat, it was not followed literally. It was very hard for Montague to have to confront Alice with such a choice, and as for Oliver, when he went home and thought it over, he began to discover gleams of hope. He might make it clear to every one that he was not responsible for his brother's business vagaries, and take his chances upon that basis. After all, there were wheels within wheels in society, and if the Robbie Wallings chose to break with him, why, they had plenty of enemies. There might even be interests which would be benefited by Allan's course, and would take him up. Montague had resolved to write and break every engagement which he had made, and to sever his connection with society at one stroke. But the next day his brother came again with compromises and new protestations. There was no use going to the other extreme. He, Oliver, would have it out with the Wallings, and they might all go on their way as if nothing had happened. So Montague made his debut in the rôle of knight-errant. He went with many qualms and misgivings, uncertain how each new person would take it. The next evening he was promised for a theatre party with Siegfried Harvey, and they had supper in a private room at Delmonico's, and there came Mrs. Winnie, resplendent as an apple tree in early April, and murmuring with bated breath, "Oh, you dreadful man, what have you been doing?" "Have I been poaching on your preserves?" he asked promptly. "No, not mine," she said, "but—" and then she hesitated. "On Mr. Duval's?" he asked. "No," she said, "not his, but everybody else's. He was telling me about it today, and there's a most dreadful uproar. He wanted me to try to find out what you were up to, and who was behind it." Montague listened wonderingly. Did Mrs. Winnie mean to imply that her husband had asked her to try to worm his business secrets out of him? That was what she seemed to imply. "I told him I never talked business with my friends," she said. "He can ask you himself, if he chooses. But what does it all mean, anyhow?" Montague smiled at the naive inconsistency. "It means nothing," said he, "except that I'm trying to get justice for a client." "But can you afford to make so many powerful enemies?" she asked. "I've taken my chances on that," he replied. Mrs. Winnie answered nothing, but looked at him with wondering admiration in her eyes. "You are different from the men about you," she remarked, after a while, and her tone gave Montague to understand that there was one person who meant to stand by him. But Mrs. Winnie Duval was not all society. Montague was amused to notice with what suddenness the stream of invitations slacked up. It was necessary for Alice to give her calling list many revisions. Freddie Van Dam had promised to invite them to his place on Long Island, and of course that invitation would never come. Likewise, they would never again see the palace of the Lester Todds upon the Jersey mountain top. Oliver put in the next few days in calling upon people to explain his embarrassing situation. He washed his hands of his brother's affairs, he said, and his friends might do the same, if they saw fit. With the Robbie Wallings he had a stormy half-hour, about which he thought it best to say little to the rest of the family. Robbie did not break with him utterly, because of their Wall Street alliance. But Mrs. Robbie's feelings were so bitter, he said, that it would be best if Alice saw nothing of her for a while. He had a long talk with Alice and explained the situation. The girl was utterly dumbfounded, for she was deeply grateful to Mrs. Robbie, and fond of her as well, and she could not believe that a friend could be so cruelly unjust to her. The upshot of the whole situation was a very painful episode. A few days later Alice met Mrs. Robbie at a reception, and she took the lady aside and tried to tell her how distressed and helpless she was. And the result was that Mrs. Robbie flew into a passion and railed at her, declaring in the presence of several people that she had sponged upon her and abused her hospitality. And so poor Alice came home weeping and half hysterical. All of which, of course, was like oil upon a fire. The heavens were lighted up with a conflagration. The next development was a paragraph in Society's scandal sheet, telling with infinite gusto how a certain ultra-fashionable matron had taken up a family of stranded waifs from his far state, and introduced them into the best circles, and even gone so far as to give a magnificent dance in their honor, and how the discovery had been made that the head of the family had been secretly preparing an attack upon their business interests, and of the tearing of hair and gnashing of teeth which had followed, and the violent quarrel in a public place. The paragraph concluded with a prediction that the strangers would find themselves the center of a merry social war. Oliver was the first to show them this paper, but lest by any chance they should miss it, half a dozen unknown friends were good enough to mail them copies, carefully marked. And then came Reggie Mann, who as freelance and gossip-gatherer sat on the fence and watched the fun. Reggie wore a thin veil of sympathy over his naked glee, and brought them the latest reports from all portions of the battleground. Thus they were able to know exactly what everybody was saying about them, who was amused and who was outraged, and who proposed to drop them and who to take them up. Montague listened for a while, but then he got tired of it, and went for a walk to escape it, but only to run into another trap. It was dark, and he was strolling down the avenue, when out of a brilliantly lighted jewelry shop came Mrs. Billy Alden to her carriage, and she hailed him with an exclamation. "You man," she cried, "what have you been doing?" He tried to laugh it off and escape, but she took him by the arm, commanding, "Get in here and tell me about it." So he found himself moving with the slow stream of vehicles on the avenue, with Mrs. Billy gazing at him quizzically and asking him if he did not feel like a hippopotamus in a frog pond. He replied to her raillery by asking her under which flag she stood. But there was little need to ask that, for anyone who was fighting a Walling became ipso facto a friend of Mrs. Billy's. She told Montague that if he felt his social position was imperiled, all he had to do was to come to her. She would gird on her armor and take the field. "But tell me how you came to do it," she said. He answered that there was very little to tell. He had taken up a case which was obviously just, but having no idea what a storm it would raise. Then he noticed that his companion was looking at him sharply. "Do you really mean that's all there is to it?" she asked. "Of course I do," said he, perplexed. "Do you know," was her unexpected response, "I hardly know what to make of you. I'm afraid to trust you on account of your brother." Montague was embarrassed. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Everybody thinks there's some trickery in that suit," she answered. "Oh," said Montague, "I see. Well, they will find out. If it will help you any to know it, I've been having no end of scenes with my brother." "I believe you," said Mrs. Billy, genially. "But it seems strange that a man could have been so blind to the situation. I feel quite ashamed because I didn't help you myself." The carriage had stopped at Mrs. Billy's home, and she asked him to dinner. "There'll be nobody but my brother," she said. "We're resting this evening, and I can make up to you for my negligence." Montague had no engagement, and so he went in, and saw Mrs. Billy's mansion, which was decorated in imitation of a doge's palace, and met Mr. Davy-Allan, a mild-mannered little gentleman who obeyed orders promptly. They had a comfortable dinner of half a dozen courses, and then retired to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Billy sank into a huge easy-chair, with a decanter of whiskey and some cracked ice in readiness beside it. Then from a tray she selected a thick black cigar, and placidly bit off the end and lighted it, and then settled back at her ease, and proceeded to tell Montague about New York, and about the great families who ruled it, and where and how they had got their money, and who were their allies and who their enemies, and what particular skeletons were hidden in each of their closets. It was worth coming a long way to listen to Mrs. Billy's tête-à-tête. Her thoughts were vigorous, and her imagery was picturesque. She spoke of old Dan Waterman, and described him as a wild boar rooting chestnuts. "He was all right," she said, "if you didn't come under his tree." And Montague asked, "Which is his tree?" And she answered, "Any one he happens to be under at the time." And then she came to the Wallings. Mrs. Billy had been on the inside of that family, and there was nothing she didn't know about it. And she brought the members up one by one, and dissected them, and exhibited them for Montague's benefit. They were typical bourgeois people, she said. They were burghers. They had never shown the least capacity for refinement. They ate and drank, and jostled other people out of the way. The old ones had been bores, and the new ones were cads. And Mrs. Billy sat and puffed at her cigar. "Do you know the history of the family?" she asked. "The founder was a rough old ferryman. He fought his rivals so well that in the end he owned all the boats. And then someone discovered the idea of buying legislatures and building railroads, and he went into that. It was a time when they simply grabbed things. If you ever look into it, you'll find they're making fortunes today out of privileges that old man simply sat down on and held. There's a bridge at Albany, for instance, to which they haven't the slightest right. My brother knows about it. They've given themselves a contract with their railroad by which they're paid for every passenger, and their profit every year is greater than the cost of the bridge. The son was the head of the family when I came in, and I found that he had it all arranged to leave $30 million to one of his sons, and only $10 million to my husband. I set to work to change that. I can tell you, I used to go round to see him and scratch his back and tickle him and make him feel good. Of course the family went wild. My, how they hated me! They set old Ellis to work to keep me off. Have you met Judge Ellis?" "I have," said Montague. "Well, there's a pussy-footed old hypocrite for you," said Mrs. Billy. "In those days he was Walling's business lackey. He used to pass the money to the legislatures and keep the wheels of the machine greased. One of the first things I said to the old man was that I didn't ask him to entertain my butler, and he mustn't ask me to entertain his valet. So I forbid Ellis to enter my house. And when I found that he was trying to get between the old man and me, I flew into a rage and boxed his ears and chased him out of the room." Mrs. Billy paused and laughed heartily over the recollection. "Of course that tickled the old man to death," she continued. "The Wallings never could make out how I managed to get round him as I did. But it was simply because I was honest with him. They'd come snivelling round, pretending they were anxious about his health, while I wanted his money, and I told him so." The valiant lady turned to the decanter. "Have some Scotch?" she asked, and poured some for herself, and then went on with her story. "When I first came to New York," she said, "the rich people's houses were all alike, all dreary brownstone fronts, sandwiched in on one or two city lots. I vowed that I would have a house with some room round it, and that was the beginning of those palaces that all New York walks by and stares at. You can hardly believe it now. Those houses were a scandal. But the sensation tickled the old man. I remember one day we walked up the avenue to see how they were coming on, and he pointed with his big stick to the second floor and asked, 'What's that?' I answered, 'It's a safe I'm building into the house.' That was a new thing, too, in those days. 'I'm going to keep my money in that,' I said. 'Bah,' he growled, 'when you're done with this house, you won't have any money left.' 'I'm planning to make you fill it for me,' I answered, and do you know, he chuckled all the way home over it." Mrs. Billy sat laughing softly to herself. "We had great old battles in those days," she said. "Among other things, I had to put the Wallings into society. They were sneaking round on the outside when I came, licking other people's boots and expecting to be kicked. I said to myself, I'll put an end to that. We'll have a showdown. So I gave a ball that made the whole country sit up and gasp. It wouldn't be noticed particularly nowadays, but then people had never dreamed of anything so gorgeous. And I made out a list of all the people I wanted to know in New York, and I said to myself, if you come, you're a friend, and if you don't, you're an enemy. And they all came, let me tell you, and there was never any question about the Wallings being in society after that." Mrs. Billy halted, and Montague remarked with a smile that doubtless she was sorry now that she had done it. "Oh, no," she answered, with a shrug of her shoulders. "I find that all I have to do is to be patient. I hate people, and think I like to poison them. But if I only wait long enough, something happens to them much worse than I ever dreamed of. You'll be revenged on the Robbies some day." "I don't want any revenge," Montague answered. "I've no quarrel with them. I simply wish I hadn't accepted their hospitality. I didn't know they were such little people. It seems hard to believe it." Mrs. Billy laughed cynically. "What could you expect?" she said. "They know there's nothing to them but their money. When that's gone, they're gone. They could never make any more." The lady gave a chuckle and added, "Those words make me think of Davy's experience when he wanted to go to Congress. Tell him about it, Davy." But Mr. Alden did not warm to the subject. He left the tale to his sister. "He was a Democrat, you know," said she, "and he went to the boss and told him he'd like to go to Congress. The answer was that it would cost him $40,000, and he kicked at the price. Others didn't have to put up such sums, he said. Why should he? And the old man growled at him, 'The rest have other things to give. One can deliver the letter carriers. Another is paid for by a corporation. But what can you do? What is there to you but your money?' So Davy paid the money, didn't you, Davy?" And Davy grinned sheepishly. "Even so," she went on, "he came off better than poor Devon. They got $50,000 out of him and sold him out, and he never got to Congress after all. That was just before he concluded that America wasn't a fit place for a gentleman to live in. And so Mrs. Billy got started on the Devons, and after that came the Havens and the Wymans and the Todds. It was midnight before she got through with them all." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The newspaper said nothing more about the Hasbrook suit, but in financial circles Montague had attained considerable notoriety because of it, and this was the means of bringing him a number of new cases. But alas, there were no more $50,000 clients. The first caller was a destitute widow with a deed which would have entitled her to the greater part of a large city in Pennsylvania. Only unfortunately the deed was about 80 years old. And then there was a poor old man who had been hurt in a streetcar accident, and had been tricked into signing away his rights, and an indignant citizen who proposed to bring 100 suits against the Traction Trust for transfers refused. All were contingency cases, with the chances of success exceedingly remote, and Montague noticed that the people had come to him as a last resort, having apparently heard of him as a man of altruistic temper. There was one case which interested him particularly, because it seemed to fit in so ominously with the grim prognosis of his brother. He received a call from an elderly gentleman, of very evident refinement and dignity of manner, who proceeded to unfold to him a most amazing story. 5 or 6 years ago he had invented a storage battery, which was the most efficient known. He had organized a company with $3 million capital to manufacture it, himself taking a third interest for his patents, and becoming president of the company. Not long afterward had come a proposal from a group of men who wished to organize a company to manufacture automobiles. They proposed to form an alliance which would give them the exclusive use of the battery. But these men were not people with whom the inventor cared to deal. They were traction and gas magnates, widely known for their unscrupulous methods, and so he had declined their offer, and set to work instead to organize an automobile company himself. He had just got under way when he discovered that his rivals had set to work to take his invention away from him. A friend who owned another third share in his company had hypothecated his stock to help form the new company, and now came a call from the bank for more collateral, and he was obliged to sell out. And at the next stockholders' meeting it developed that their rivals had bought it, and likewise more stock in the open market, and they proceeded to take possession of the company, ousting the former president, and then making a contract with their automobile company to furnish the storage battery at a price which left no profit for the manufacturers. And so for 2 years the inventor had not received $1 of dividends upon his $1 million worth of paper, and to cap the climax, the company had refused to sell the battery to his automobile company, and so that he had gone into bankruptcy, and his friends were ruined also. Montague went into the case very carefully, and found that the story was true. What interested him particularly in it was the fact that he had met a couple of these financial highwaymen in social life. He had come to know the son and heir of one of them quite well, at Siegfried Harvey's. This gilded youth was engaged to be married in a very few days, and the papers had it that the father-in-law had presented the bride with a check for $1 million. Montague could not but wonder if it was the million that had been taken from his client. There was to be a bachelor dinner at the millionaire's on the night before the wedding, to which he and Oliver had been invited. As he was thinking of taking up his case, he went to his brother, saying he wished to decline. But Oliver had been getting back his courage day by day, and declared that it was more important than ever now that he should hold his ground and face his enemies, for Alice's sake, if not for his own. And so Montague went to the dinner, and saw deeper yet into the history of the stolen millions. It was a very beautiful affair in the beginning. There was a large private dining room, elaborately decorated, with a string orchestra concealed in a bower of plants. But there were cocktails even on the sideboard at the doorway, and by the time the guests had got to the coffee, everyone was hilariously drunk. After each toast they would hurl their glasses over their shoulders. The purpose of a bachelor dinner, it appeared, was a farewell to the old days and the boon companions, so there were sentimental and comic songs which had been composed for the occasion, and were received with whirlwinds of laughter. By listening closely and reading between the lines, one might get quite a history of the young host's adventurous career. There was a house up on the West Side, and there was a yacht with orgies in every part of the world. There was the summer night in Newport Harbor when someone had hit upon the dazzling scheme of freezing $20 gold pieces in tiny blocks of ice to be dropped down the girls' backs. And there was a banquet in a studio in New York when a huge pie had been brought on, and from which a half-nude girl had emerged, with a flock of canary birds about her. Then there was a damsel who had been wont to dance upon the tops of supper tables, clad in diaphanous costume, and who had got drunk after a theatre party and set out to smash up a Broadway restaurant. There was a cousin from Chicago, a wild lad, who made a specialty of this diversion, and whose mistresses were bathed in champagne. Apparently there were numberless places in the city where such orgies were carried on continually. There were private clubs and artists' studios. There were several allusions to a high tower, which Montague did not comprehend. Many such matters, however, were explained to him by an elderly gentleman who sat on his right, and who seemed to stay sober, no matter how much he drank. Incidentally, he gravely advised Montague to meet one of the young host's mistresses, who was a stunning girl and was in the market. Towards morning the festivities changed to a series of wrestling bouts. The young men stripped off their clothing and tore the table to pieces, and piled it out of the way in a corner, smashing most of the crockery in the process. Between the matches, champagne would be opened by knocking off the heads of the bottles, and this went on until 4 o'clock in the morning, when many of the guests were lying in heaps upon the floor. Montague rode home in a cab with the elderly gentleman who had sat next to him, and on the way he asked if such affairs as this were common, and his companion, who was a steel man from the West, replied by telling him of some which he had witnessed at home. At Siegfried Harvey's theatre party, Montague had seen a popular actress in a musical comedy, which was then the most successful play running in New York. The house was sold out weeks ahead, and after the matinee you might observe the street in front of the stage entrance blocked by people waiting to see the woman come out. She was lithe and supple, like a panther, and wore close-fitting gowns to reveal her form. It seemed that her play must have been built with one purpose in mind, to see how much lewdness could be put upon a stage without interference by the police. And now his companion told him how this woman had been invited to sing at a banquet given by magnates of a mighty trust, and had gone after midnight to the most exclusive club in the town, and sung her popular ditty, "Won't you come and play with me?" The merry magnates had taken the invitation literally, with the result that the actress had escaped from the room with half her clothing torn off her. A little while later, an official of his trust had wished to get rid of his wife and marry a chorus girl, and when public clamour had forced the directors to ask him to resign, he had replied by threatening to tell about this banquet. The next day, or rather to be precise, that same morning, Montague and Alice attended the gorgeous wedding. It was declared by the newspapers to be the most important social event of the week, and it took half a dozen policemen to hold back the crowds which filled the street. The ceremony took place at St. Cecilia's, with the stately bishop officiating in his purple and scarlet robes. Inside the doors were all the elect, exquisitely groomed and gowned, and such a medley of delicious perfumes as not all the vales in Arcady could equal. The groom had been polished and scrubbed, and looked very handsome. though somewhat pale, and Montague could not but smile as he observed the best man looking so very solemn, and recollected the drunken wrestler of a few hours before, staggering about in a pale blue undershirt ripped up the back. The Montagues knew by this time whom they were to avoid. They were graciously taken under the wing of Mrs. Eldridge Devon, whose real estate was not affected by insurance suits, and the next morning they had the satisfaction of seeing their names in a list of those present, and even a couple of lines about Alice's costume. Alice was always referred to as Miss Montague. It was very pleasant to be the Miss Montague, and to think of all the other would-be Miss Montagues in the city who were thereby haughtily rebuked. In the yellow papers there was also accounts of the trousseau of the bride, and the wonderful gifts which she had received, and of the long honeymoon which she was to spend in the Mediterranean upon her husband's yacht. Montague found himself wondering if the ghosts of its former occupants would not haunt her, and whether she would have been as happy had she known as much as he knew. He found food for a good deal of thought in the memory of this banquet. Among the things which he had gathered from the songs was a hint that Oliver also had some secrets which he had not seen fit to tell his brother. The keeping of young girls was apparently one of the established customs of the little brothers of the rich, and, for that matter, many of the big brothers also. A little later Montague had a curious glimpse into the life of this half-world. He had occasion on one evening to call upon a certain financier who he had come to know quite well, a man of family and a member of the church. There were some important papers to be signed and sent off by a steamer, and the great man's secretary said that he would try to find him. A minute or two later he called up Montague and asked him if he would be good enough to go to an address uptown. It was a house not far from Riverside Drive, and Montague went up there and found his acquaintance, with several other prominent men of affairs whom he knew, conversing in a drawing-room with one of the most charming ladies he had ever met. She was exquisite to look at, and one of the few people in New York whom he had found worth listening to. He spent such an enjoyable evening that when he was leaving he remarked to the lady that he would like his cousin Alice to meet her, and then he noticed that she flushed slightly and was embarrassed. Later on he learned to his dismay that the charming and beautiful lady did not go into society. Nor was this at all rare. On the contrary, if one took the trouble to make inquiries, he would find that such establishments were everywhere taken for granted. Montague talked about it with Major Venable, and out of his gossip storehouse the old gentleman drew forth a string of anecdotes that made one's hair stand on end. There was one all-powerful magnate who had a passion for the wife of a great physician, and had given $1 million or so to build a hospital, and had provided that it should be the finest in the world, and that this physician should go abroad for 3 years to study the institutions of Europe. No conventions counted with this old man. If he saw a woman whom he wanted, he would ask for her, and women in society felt that it was an honor to be his mistress. Not long after this, a man who voiced the anguish of a mighty nation was turned out of several hotels in New York because he was not married according to the laws of South Dakota. But this other man would take a woman to any hotel in the city, and no one would dare oppose him. And there was another, a great traction king, who kept mistresses in Chicago and Paris and London, as well as in New York, and he had one just around the corner from his palatial home, and had an underground passage leading to it. And the Major told with glee how he had shown this to a friend, and the latter had remarked, "I'm too stout to get through there." "I know it," replied the other, "else I shouldn't have told you." And so it went. One of the richest men in New York was a sexual degenerate, with half a dozen women on his hands all the time. He would send them checks, and they would use these to blackmail him. This man's young wife had been shut up in a closet for 24 hours by her mother, to compel her to marry him. And then there was the charming tale of how he had gone away upon a mission of state, and had written long messages full of tender protestations, and had given them to a newspaper correspondent to cable home to his wife. The correspondent thought it such a touching example of conjugal devotion that he told about it at a dinner party when he came back, and was struck by the sudden silence that fell. "The messages had been sent to a code address," chuckled the Major, "and every one at the table knew who had got them." A few days after this, Montague received a telephone message from Siegfried Harvey, who said he wanted to see him about a matter of business. He asked him to lunch at the Noonday Club, and Montague went, though not without a qualm, for it was in the Fidelity Building, the enemy's bailiwick, a magnificent structure with halls of white marble, and a lavish display of bronze. It occurred to Montague that somewhere in this structure people were at work preparing an answer to his charges. He wondered what they were saying. The two had lunch, talking meanwhile about the coming events in society, and about politics and wars, and when the coffee was served, and they were alone in the room, Harvey settled his big frame back in a chair and began. "In the first place," he said, "I must explain that I have something to say that is devilish hard to get into. I'm so much afraid of your jumping to the wrong conclusion in the middle of it. I'd like you to agree to listen for a minute or two before you think at all." "All right," said Montague with a smile. "Fire away." And at once the other became grave. "You've taken a case against this company," he said, "and Ollie has talked enough to me to make me understand that you've done a plucky thing, and that you must be everlastingly sick of hearing from cowardly people who want you to drop it. I'd be very sorry to be classed with them, for even a moment, and you must understand at the outset that I haven't a particle of interest in the company, and that it wouldn't matter to me if I had. I don't try to use my friends in business, and I don't let money count with me in my social life. I made up my mind to take the risk of speaking to you about this case simply because I happen to know one or two things about it that I thought you didn't know. And if that's so, you are at a great disadvantage. But in any case, please understand that I have no motive but friendship, and so if I am butting in, excuse me." When Siegfried Harvey talked, he looked straight at one with his clear blue eyes, and there was no doubting his honesty. "I am very much obliged to you," said Montague. "Pray tell me what you have to say." "All right," said the other. "It can be done very quickly. You have taken a case which involves a great many sacrifices upon your part, and I wondered if it had ever occurred to you to ask whether you might not be taken advantage of." "How do you mean?" asked Montague. "Do you know the people who are behind you?" inquired the other. "Do you know them well enough to be sure what are their motives in the case?" Montague hesitated and thought. "No," he said, "I couldn't say that I do." "Then it's just as I thought," replied Harvey. "I've been watching you. You are an honest man, and you're putting yourself to no end of trouble for the best of motives. And unless I'm mistaken, you're being used by men who are not honest, and whom you wouldn't work with if you knew their purposes." "What purposes could they have?" "There are several possibilities. In the first place, it might be a strike suit. Somebody who is hoping to be bought off for a big price. That's what nearly everyone thinks is the case. But I don't. I think it's more likely someone within the company who is trying to put the administration in a hole." "Who could that be?" exclaimed Montague, amazed. "I don't know that. I'm not familiar enough with the situation in fidelity. It's changing all the time. I simply know that there are factions struggling for control of it, and hating each other furiously, and ready to do anything in the world to cripple each other. You know that their 40 millions of surplus gives an enormous power. I'd rather be able to swing 40 millions in the street than to have 10 millions in my own right. And so the giants are fighting for control of those companies. And if you can't tell who's in and who's out, you can never know the real meaning of anything that happens in the struggle. All that you can be sure of is that the game is crooked from end to end, and that nothing that happens in it is what it pretends to be." Montague listened, half dazed, and feeling as if the ground he stood on were caving beneath his feet. "What do you know about those who brought you this case?" asked his companion suddenly. "Not much," he said weakly. Harvey hesitated a moment. "Understand me, please," he said. "I've no wish to pry into your affairs, and if you don't care to say any more, I'll understand it perfectly. But I've heard it said that the man who started the thing was Ellis." Montague in his turn hesitated. Then he said, "That is correct, between you and me." "Very good," said Harvey, "and that is what made me suspicious. Do you know anything about Ellis?" "I didn't," said the other. "I've heard a little since." "I can fancy so," said Harvey, "and I can tell you that Ellis is mixed up in life insurance matters in all sorts of dubious ways. It seems to me that you have reason to be more careful where you follow him." Montague sat with his hands clenched and his brows knitted. His friend's talk had been like a flash of lightning. It revealed huge menacing forms in the darkness about him. All the structure of his hopes seemed to be tottering. His case that he had worked so hard over, his $50,000 that he had been so proud of. Could it be that he had been tricked and had made a fool of himself? "How in the world am I to know?" he cried. "That is more than I can tell," said his friend. "And for that matter, I'm not sure that you could do anything now. All that I could do was to warn you what sort of ground you were treading on, so that you could watch out for yourself in future." Montague thanked him heartily for that service, and then he went back to his office and spent the rest of the day pondering the matter. What he had heard had made a vast change in things. Before it, everything had seemed simple, and now nothing was clear. He was overwhelmed with a sense of utter futility of his efforts. He was trying to build a house upon quicksands. There was nowhere a solid spot upon which he could set his foot. There was nowhere any truth. There were only contending powers who used the phrases of truth for their own purposes. And now he saw himself as the world saw him, a party to a piece of trickery, a knave like all the rest. He felt that he had been tripped up at the first step in his career. The conclusion of the whole matter was that he took an afternoon train for Albany, and the next morning he talked the matter out with the judge. Montague had realized the need of going slowly, for, after all, he had no definite ground for suspicion. And so, very tactfully and cautiously, he explained that it had come to his ears that many people believed that there were interested parties behind the suit of Mr. Hasbrook, and that this had made him uncomfortable, as he knew nothing whatever about his client. He had come to ask the judge's advice in the matter. No one could have taken the thing more graciously than did the great man. He was all kindness and tact. In the first place, he said, he had warned him in advance that enemies would attack him and slander him, and that all kinds of subtle means would be used to influence him. And he must understand that these rumors were part of such a campaign. It made no difference how good a friend had brought them to him. How could he know who had brought them to that friend? The judge ventured to hope that nothing that anyone might say could influence him to believe that he, the judge, would have advised him to do anything improper. "No," said Montague, "but can you assure me that there are no interested parties behind Mr. Hasbrook?" "Interested parties?" asked the other. "I mean people connected with the Fidelity or other insurance companies." "Why, no," said the Judge. "I certainly couldn't assure you of that." Montague looked surprised. "You mean you don't know?" "I mean," was the answer, "that I wouldn't feel at liberty to tell, even if I did know." And Montague stared at him. He had not been prepared for this frankness. "It never occurred to me," the other continued, "that that was a matter which could make any difference to you." "Why—" began Montague. "Pray understand me, Mr. Montague," said the Judge. "It seemed to me that this was obviously a just case, and it seemed so to you. And the only other matter that I thought you might have a right to be assured of was that it was seriously meant. Of that I felt assured. It did not seem to me of any importance that there might be interested individuals behind Mr. Hasbrook. Let us suppose, for instance, that there were some parties who had been offended by the administration of the Fidelity, and were anxious to punish it. Could a lawyer be justified in refusing to take a just case simply because he knew of such private motives? Or let us assume an extreme case, a factional fight within the company, as you say has been suggested to you. Well, that would be a case of thieves falling out. And is there any reason why the public should not reap the advantage of such a situation? The men inside the company are the ones who would know first what is going on. And if you saw a chance to use such an advantage in a just fight, would you not do it?" So the Judge went on, gracious and plausible, and so subtly and exquisitely corrupting. Underneath his smoothly flowing sentences, Montague could feel the presence of one fundamental thought. It was unuttered and even unhinted, but it pervaded the Judge's discourse as a mood pervades a melody. The young lawyer had got a big fee, and he had a nice easy case, and as a man of the world he could not really wish to pry into it too closely. He had heard gossip, and had felt that his reputation required him to be disturbed. But he had come simply to be smoothed down the back and made at ease, and enabled to keep his fee without losing his good opinion of himself. Montague quit because he concluded that it was not worth while to try to make himself understood. After all, he was in the case now, and there was nothing to be gained by a breach. Two things he felt he had made certain by the interview. First, that his client was a dummy, and that it was really a case of thieves falling out. And second, that he had no guarantee that he might not be left in the lurch at any moment, except the touching confidence of the Judge in some parties unknown. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Montague came home with his mind made up that there was nothing he could do except to be more careful next time. For this mistake he would have to pay the price. He had still to learn what the full price was. The day after his return there came a caller. Mr. John C. Burton read his card. He proved to be a canvassing agent for the company which published the scandal sheet of society. They were preparing a deluxe account of the prominent families of New York, a very sumptuous affair, with a highly exclusive set of subscribers, at the rate of $1,500 per set. Would Mr. Montague, by any chance, care to have his family included? And Mr. Montague explained politely that he was a comparative stranger in New York, and would not belong properly in such a volume. But the agent was not satisfied with this. There might be reasons for his subscribing. Even so, there might be special cases. Mr. Montague, as a stranger, might not realize the important nature of the offer. After he had consulted his friends, he might change his mind, and so on. As Montague listened to this series of broad hints, and took in the meaning of them, the colour mounted to his cheeks, until at last he rose abruptly and bid the man good afternoon. But then, as he sat alone, his anger died away, and there was left only discomfort and uneasiness. And 3 or 4 days later he bought another issue of the paper, and sure enough, there was a new paragraph. He stood on the street corner reading it. The social war was raging hotly, it said, and added that Mrs. de Graffenreid was threatening to take up the cause of the strangers. Then it went on to picture a certain exquisite young man of fashion who was rushing about among his friends to apologize for his brother's indiscretions. Also, it said, there was a brilliant social queen, wife of a great banker, who had taken up the cudgels. And then came 3 sentences more, which made the blood leap like a flame into Montague's cheeks. There have not been lacking comments upon her suspicious ardour. It has been noticed that since the advent of the romantic-looking Southerner, this restless lady's interest in the Babists and the trance mediums has waned, and now society is watching for the denouement of a most interesting situation. To Montague these words came like a blow in the face. He went down the street half dazed. It seemed to him the blackest shame that New York had yet shown him. He clenched his fists as he walked, whispering to himself, "The scoundrels!" He realized instantly that he was helpless. Down home one would have thrashed the editor of such a paper, but here he was in the wolves' own country, and he could do nothing. He went back to his office and sat down at the desk. "My dear Miss Winnie," he wrote, "I have just read the enclosed paragraph, and I cannot tell you how profoundly pained I am that your kindness to us should have made you the victim of such an outrage. I am quite helpless in the matter, except to enable you to avoid any further annoyance. Please believe me when I say that we shall all of us understand perfectly if you think we had best not meet again at present, and that this will make no difference whatever in our feelings." This letter Montague sent by a messenger, and then he went home. Perhaps 10 minutes after he arrived, the telephone bell rang, and there was Mrs. Winnie. "Your note has come," she said. "Have you an engagement this evening?" "No," he answered. "Well," she said, "will you come to dinner?" "Mrs. Winnie," he protested. "Please come," she said, "please." "I hate to have you," he began. "I wish you to come," she said a third time. So he answered, "Very well." He went, and when he entered the house, the butler led him to the elevator, saying, "Mrs. Duval says will you please come upstairs, sir?" And there Mrs. Winnie met him, with flushed cheeks and eager countenance. She was even lovelier than usual, in a soft cream-coloured gown, and a crimson rose in her bosom. "I am all alone to-night," she said, "so we'll dine in my apartments. We'd be lost in that big room downstairs." She led him into her drawing-room, where great armfuls of new roses scattered their perfume. There was a table set for 2, and 2 big chairs before the fire which blazed in the hearth. Montague noticed that her hand trembled a little, and she motioned him to one of them. He could read her excitement in her whole aspect. She was flinging down the gauntlet to her enemies. "Let us eat first and talk afterwards," she said hurriedly. "We'll be happy for a while, anyway." And she went on to be happy in her nervous and eager way. She talked about the new opera which was to be given, and about Mrs. de Graffenreid's new entertainment, and about Miss Ridgely Clevenden's ball. Also about the hospital for crippled children which she wanted to build, and about Mrs. Vivie Patton's rumoured divorce. And meantime the sphinx-like attendants moved here and there, and the dinner came and went. They took their coffee in the big chairs by the fire, and the table was swept clear, and the servants vanished, closing the doors behind them. Then Montague set his cup aside, and sat gazing sombrely into the fire, and Mrs. Winnie watched him. There was a long silence. Suddenly he heard her voice. "Do you find it so easy to give up our friendship?" she asked. "I didn't think about it being easy or hard," he answered. "I simply thought of protecting you." "And do you think that my friends are nothing to me?" she demanded. "Have I so very many as that?" And she clenched her hands with a sudden passionate gesture. "Do you think that I will let those wretches frighten me into doing what they want? I'll not give in to them, not for anything that Leila can do." A look of perplexity crossed Montague's face. "Leila?" he asked. "Mrs. Robbie Walling!" she cried. "Don't you suppose that she is responsible for that paragraph?" Montague started. "That's the way they fight their battles," cried Mrs. Winnie. "They pay money to those scoundrels to be protected, and then they send nasty gossip about people they wish to injure." "You don't mean that!" exclaimed the man. "Of course I do," cried she. "I know that it's true. I know that Robbie Walling paid $15,000 for some trumpery volumes that they got out. And how do you suppose the paper gets its gossip?" "I didn't know," said Montague, "but I never dreamed." "Why," exclaimed Mrs. Winnie, "their mail is full of blue and gold monogram stationery. I've known guests to sit down and write gossip about their hostesses in their own homes. Oh, you've no idea of people's vileness." "I had some idea," said Montague, after a pause. "That was why I wished to protect you." "I don't wish to be protected!" she cried vehemently. "I'll not give them the satisfaction. They wish to make me give you up, and I'll not do it for anything they can say." Montague sat with knitted brows, gazing into the fire. "When I read that paragraph," he said slowly, "I could not bear to think of the unhappiness it might cause you. I thought of how much it might disturb your husband." "My husband?" echoed Mrs. Winnie. There was a hard tone in her voice as she went on. "He will fix it up with them," she said. "That's his way. There will be nothing more published. You can feel sure about that." Montague sat in silence. That was not the reply he had expected, and it rather disconcerted him. "If that were all," he said, with hesitation. "But I could not know. I thought that the paragraph might disturb him for another reason, that it might be a cause of unhappiness between you and him." There was a pause. "You don't understand," said Mrs. Winnie at last. Without turning his head he could see her hands, as they lay upon her knees. She was moving them nervously. "You don't understand," she repeated. When she began to speak again, it was in a low, trembling voice. "I must tell you," she said. "I have felt sure that you did not know." There was another pause. She hesitated, and her hands trembled. Then suddenly she hurried on. "I wanted you to know. I do not love my husband. I am not bound to him. He has nothing to say in my affairs." Montague sat rigid, turned to stone. He was half dazed by the words. He could feel Mrs. Winnie's gaze fixed upon him, and he could feel the hot flush that spread over her throat and cheeks. It was not fair for you not to know," she whispered, and her voice died away. And there was again a silence. Montague was dumb. "Why don't you say something?" she panted at last, and he caught the note of anguish in her voice. Then he turned and stared at her, and saw her tightly clenched hands and the quiver of her lips. He was shocked quite beyond speech, and he saw her bosom heaving quickly, and saw the tears start into her eyes. Suddenly she sank down and covered her face with her hands and broke into frantic sobbing. "Mrs. Winnie!" he cried, and started to his feet. Her outburst continued. He saw that she was shuddering violently. "Then you don't love me?" she wailed. He stood trembling and utterly bewildered. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "Oh, Mrs. Winnie, I had no idea." "I know it, I know it!" she cried. "It's my fault. I was a fool. I knew it all the time. But I thought you might if you knew." And then again her tears choked her. She was convulsed with pain and grief. Montague stood watching her, helpless with distress. She caught hold of the arm of the chair convulsively, and he put his hand upon hers. "Mrs. Winnie," he began. But she jerked her hand away and hid it. "No, no," she cried in terror. "Don't touch me." And suddenly she looked up at him, stretching out her arms. "Don't you understand that I love you?" she exclaimed. "You despise me for it, I know, but I can't help it. I will tell you even so. It is the only satisfaction I can have. I have always loved you, and I thought it was only that you didn't understand. I was ready to brave all the world. I didn't care who knew it, or what anybody said. I thought we could be happy. I thought I could be free at last. Oh, you've no idea how unhappy I am, and how lonely, and how I long to escape. And I believe that you might—" And then the tears gushed into Mrs. Winnie's eyes again, and her voice became the voice of a little child. "Don't you think you might come to love me?" she wailed. Her voice shook Montague so that he trembled to the depths of him, but his face only became the more grave. "You despise me because I told you!" she exclaimed. "No, no, Miss Winnie," he said. "I could not possibly do that." Then why," she whispered, "why would it be so hard to love me?" "It would be very easy," he said, "but I dare not let myself." She looked at him piteously. "You are so cold, so merciless," she cried. He answered nothing, and she sat trembling. "Have you ever loved a woman?" she asked. There was a long pause. He sat in the chair again. "Listen, Mrs. Winnie," he began at last. "Don't call me that!" she exclaimed. "Call me Evelyn, please." "Very well," he said. "Evelyn, I did not intend to make you unhappy. If I had had any idea, I should never have seen you again. I will tell you what I have never told anybody before. Then you will understand." He sat for a few moments in a sombre reverie. "Once," he said, "when I was young, I loved a woman, a quadroon girl. That was in New Orleans. It was a custom we have there. They have a world of their own, and we take care of them, and of the children, and every one knows about it. I was very young, only about 18, and she was even younger. But I found out then what women are, and what love means to them. I saw how they could suffer. And then she died in childbirth. The child died too." Montague's voice was very low, and Mrs. Winnie sat with her hands clasped, and her eyes riveted upon his face. "I saw her die," he said, "and that was all. I have never forgotten it. I made up my mind then that I had done wrong, and that never again, while I lived, would I offer my love to a woman, unless I could devote all my life to her. So you see, I am afraid of love. I do not wish to suffer so much, or to make others suffer. And when anyone speaks to me as you did, it brings it all back to me. It makes me shrink up and wither." He paused, and the other caught her breath. "Understand me," she said, her voice trembling. "I would not ask any pledges of you. I would pay whatever price there was to pay. I am not afraid to suffer." "I do not wish you to suffer," he said. "I do not wish to take advantage of any woman." "But I have nothing in the world that I value," she cried. "I would go away, I would give up everything to be with a man like you. I have no ties, no duties." He interrupted her. "You have your husband," he said. And she cried out in sudden fury, "My husband?" "Has no one ever told you about my husband?" she asked, after a pause. "No one," he said. "Well, ask them," she exclaimed. "Meantime, take my word for it, I owe nothing to my husband." Montague sat staring into the fire. "But consider my own case," he said. "I have duties, my mother and my cousin." "Oh, don't say any more!" cried the woman, with a break in her voice. "Say that you don't love me. That is all there is to say. And you will never respect me again. I've been a fool. I've ruined everything. I have flung away your friendship that I might have kept." "No," he said. She rushed on vehemently. "At least I have been honest. Give me credit for that. That is how all my troubles come. I say what is on my mind, and I pay the price for my blunders. It is not as if I were cold and calculating, so don't despise me altogether." "I couldn't despise you," said Montague. "I am simply pained because I have made you unhappy, and I did not mean to." Mrs. Winnie sat staring ahead of her in a sombre reverie. "Don't think any more about it," she said bitterly. "I will get over it. I am not worth troubling about. Don't you suppose I know how you feel about this world that I live in? And I'm part of it. I beat my wings and try to get out, but I can't. I'm in it, and I'll stay in till I die. I might as well give up. I thought that I could steal a little joy. You have no idea how hungry I am for a little joy. You have no idea how lonely I am, and how empty my life is. You talk about your fear of making me unhappy. It's a grim jest. But I'll give you permission, if you can. I'll ask nothing, no promises, no sacrifices. I'll take all the risks and pay all the penalties." She smiled through her tears, a sardonic smile. He was watching her, and she turned again, and their eyes met. Again he saw the blood mount from her throat to her cheeks. At the same time came the old stirring of the wild beast within him. He knew that the less time he spent in sympathizing with Mrs. Winnie, the better for both of them. He started to rise, and the words of farewell were on his lips, when suddenly there came a knock upon the door. Mrs. Winnie sprang to her feet. "Who is that?" she cried. And the door opened, and Mr. Duval entered. "Good evening," he said pleasantly, and came toward her. Mrs. Winnie flushed angrily, and stared at him. "Why do you come here unannounced?" she cried. "I apologize," he said, "but I found this in my mail." And Montague, in the act of rising to greet him, saw that he had the offensive clipping in his hand. Then he saw Duval give a start, and realized that the man had not been aware of his presence in the room. Duval gazed from Montague to his wife, and noticed for the first time her tears and her agitation. "I beg pardon," he said. "I'm evidently trespassing." "You most certainly are," responded Mrs. Winnie. He made a move to withdraw, but before he could take a step, she had brushed past him and left the room, slamming the door behind her. And Duval stared after her, and then he stared at Montague, and laughed. "Well, well, well," he said. Then, checking his amusement, he added, "Good evening, sir." "Good evening," said Montague. He was trembling slightly, and Duval noticed it. He smiled genially. "This is the sort of material out of which scenes are made," said he. "But I beg you not to be embarrassed. We won't have any scenes." Montague could think of nothing to say to that. "I owe Evelyn an apology," the other continued. "It was entirely an accident. This clipping, you see. I do not intrude as a rule. You may make yourself at home in future." Montague flushed scarlet at the words. "Mr. Duval," he said, "I have to assure you that you are mistaken." The other stared at him. "Oh, come, come," he said, laughing. "Let us talk as men of the world." "I say that you are mistaken," said Montague again. The other shrugged his shoulders. "Very well," he said, genially. "As you please. I simply wish to make matters clear to you. That's all. I wish you joy with Evelyn. I say nothing about her. You love her. Suffice it that I have had her, and I'm tired of her. The field is yours, but keep her out of mischief, and don't let her make a fool of herself in public, if you can help it. And don't let her spend too much money. She costs me $1,000,000 a year already. Good evening, Mr. Montague." And he went out. Montague, who stood like a statue, could hear him chuckling all the way down the hall. At last Montague himself started to leave, but he heard Mrs. Winnie coming back, and he waited for her. She came in and shut the door and turned toward him. "What did he say?" she asked. "He was very pleasant," said Montague. and she smiled grimly. "I went out on purpose," she said. "I wanted you to see him, to see what sort of man he is, and how much duty I owe him. You saw, I guess." "Yes, I saw," said he. Then again he started to go, but she took him by the arm. "Come and talk to me," she said, "please." She led him back to the fire. "Listen," she said. "He will not come here again. He is going away tonight. I thought he had gone already, and he does not return for a month or two. There will be no one to disturb us." She came close to him and gazed up into his face. She had wiped her tears away, and her happy look had come back to her. She was lovelier than ever. "I took you by surprise," she said, smiling. "You didn't know what to make of it, and I was ashamed. I thought you would hate me. But I'm not going to be unhappy any more. I don't care at all. I'm glad that I spoke." And Mrs. Winnie put up her hands and took him by the lapels of his coat. "I know that you love me," she said. "I saw it in your eyes just now, before he came in. It is simply that you won't let yourself go. You have so many doubts and so many fears. But you will see that I am right. You will learn to love me. You won't be able to help it. I shall be so kind and good. Only don't go away." Mrs. Winnie was so close to him that her breath touched his cheek. "Promise me, dear," she whispered. "Promise me that you won't stop seeing me, that you will learn to love me. I can't do without you." Montague was trembling in every nerve. He felt like a man caught in a net. Mrs. Winnie had had everything she ever wanted in her life, and now she wanted him. It was impossible for her to face any other thought. "Listen," he began gently. But she saw the look of resistance in his eyes, and she cried, "No, no, don't! I cannot do without you. Think! I love you. What more can I say to you? I cannot believe that you don't care for me. You have been fond of me. I've seen it in your face. Yet you're afraid of me. Why? Look at me. Am I not beautiful to look at? And is a woman's love such a little thing? Can you fling it away and trample upon it so easily? Why do you wish to go? Don't you understand? No one knows we are here. No one cares. You can come here whenever you wish. This is my place, mine, and no one will think anything about it. They all do it. There's nothing to be afraid of." She put her arms about him and clung to him, so that he could feel the beating of her heart upon his bosom. "Oh, don't leave me here alone tonight," she cried. To Montague it was like the ringing of an alarm bell deep within his soul. "I must go," he said. She flung back her head and stared at him. He saw the terror and anguish in her eyes. "No, no!" she cried. "Don't say that to me. I can't bear it. Oh, see what I have done! Look at me! Have mercy on me!" "Mrs. Winnie," he said, "you must have mercy on me." But he only felt her clasp him more tightly. He took her by the wrists, and with quiet force he broke her hold upon him. Her hands fell to her sides, and she stared at him aghast. "I must go," he said again, and he started toward the door. She followed him dumbly with her eyes. "Good-bye," he said. He knew that there was no use of any more words. His sympathy had been like oil upon flames. He saw her move, and as he opened the door, she flung herself down in a chair and burst into frantic weeping. He shut the door softly and went away. He found his way down the stairs and got his hat and coat and went out unseen by anyone. He walked down the avenue, and there suddenly was the giant bulk of St. Cecilia's lifting itself into the sky. He stopped and looked at it. It seemed a great tumultuous surge of emotion. And for the first time in his life it seemed to him that he understood why men had put together that towering heap of stone. Then he went on home. He found Alice dressing for a ball, and Oliver waiting for her. He went to his room and took off his coat, and Oliver came up to him, and with a sudden gesture reached over to his shoulder and held up a trophy. He drew it out carefully, and measured the length of it, smiling mischievously in the meanwhile. Then he held it up to the light, to see the color of it. "A black one," he cried, "coal black." And he looked at his brother, with a merry twinkle in his eyes. "Oh, Allan," he chuckled. Montague said nothing. Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was about a week from the beginning of Lent, when there would be a lull in the city's gaieties, and society would shift the scene of its activities to the country clubs, and to California and hot springs in Palm Beach. Mrs. Caroline Smith invited Alice to join her in an expedition to the last named place, but Montague interposed, because he saw that Alice had been made pale and nervous by 3 months of night-and-day festivities. Also, a trip to Florida would necessitate $10,000 or $15,000 worth of new clothes, and these would not do for the summer, it appeared. They would be faded and passé by that time. So Alice settled back to rest, but she was too popular to be let alone. A few days later came another invitation, this time from General Prentice and his family. They were planning a railroad trip, to be gone for a month, and they would have a private train and 25 people in the party, and would take in California and Mexico, swinging round the circle, as it was called. Alice was wild to go, and Montague gave his consent. Afterward he learned, to his dismay, that Charlie Carter was one of those invited, and he would have liked to have Alice withdraw, but she did not wish to, and he could not make up his mind to insist. These train trips were the very latest diversion of the well-to-do. A year ago no one had heard of them, and now 50 parties were leaving New York every month. You might see a dozen of such hotel trains at once at Palm Beach. There were some people who lived on board all the time, having special tracks built for them in pleasant locations wherever they stopped. One man had built a huge automobile railroad car, shaped like a ram, and having accommodation for 60 people. The Prentice train had 4 cars, one of them a library car, finished in St. Igo mahogany, and provided with a pipe organ. Also there were bathrooms and a barber shop, and a baggage car with 2 autos on board for exploring purposes. Since the episode of Mrs. Winnie, Oliver had apparently concluded that his brother was one of the initiated. Not long afterward he permitted him to a glimpse into that side of his life which had been hinted at in the songs at the bachelor's dinner. Oliver had planned to take Betty Wyman to the theatre, but Betty's grandfather had come home from the West unexpectedly, and so Oliver came round and took his brother instead. "I was going to play a joke on her," he said. "We'll go to see one of my old flames." It was a translation of a French farce, in which the marital infidelities of 2 young couples were the occasion of many mishaps. One of the characters was a waiting-maid, who was in love with a handsome young soldier, and was pursued by the husband of one of the couples. It was a minor part, but the young Jewish girl who played it had so many pretty graces and such a merry laugh that she made it quite conspicuous. When the act was over, Oliver asked him whose acting he liked best, and he named her. "Come and be introduced to her," Oliver said. He opened a door near their box. "How do you do, Mr. Wilson?" he said, nodding to a man in evening dress, who stood near by. Then he turned towards the dressing-rooms, and went down a corridor and knocked upon one of the doors. A voice called, "Come in," and he opened the door, and there was a tiny room, with odds and ends of clothing scattered about, and the girl, clad in corsets and underskirt, sitting before a mirror.
"Hello, Rosalie," said he. And she dropped her powder puff and sprang up with a cry, "Ollie!" In a moment more she had her arms about his neck. "Oh, you wretched man!" she cried. "Why don't you come to see me any more? Didn't you get my letters?" "I got some," said he, "but I've been busy. This is my brother, Mr. Allan Montague." The other nodded to Montague and said, "How do you do?" but without letting go of Oliver. "Why don't you come to see me?" she exclaimed. "There, there now," said Oliver, laughing good-naturedly. "I brought my brother along so that you'd have to behave yourself." "I don't care about your brother!" exclaimed the girl, without even giving him another glance. Then she held Oliver at arm's length and gazed into his face. "How can you be so cruel to me?" she asked. "I told you I was busy," he said cheerfully, "and I gave you fair warning, didn't I? How's Toodles?" "Oh, Toodles is in raptures," said Rosalie. "She's got a new fellow," and then, her manner changing to one of merriment, she added, "Oh, Ollie, he gave her a diamond brooch, and she looks like a countess. She's hoping for a chance to wear it in a part." "You've seen Toodles?" said Oliver to his brother. "She's in the Caliph of Kamchatka." "They're going on the road next week," said Rosalie, "and then I'll be all alone." She added in a pleading voice, "Do, Ollie, be a good boy and take us out tonight. Think how long it's been since I've seen you. Why, I've been so good I don't know myself in the looking-glass. Please, Ollie." "All right," said he, "maybe I will." "I'm not going to let you get away from me," she cried. "I'll come right over the footlights after you." "You'd better get dressed," said Oliver. "You'll be late." He pushed aside a tray with some glasses on it, and seated himself upon a trunk, and Montague stood in a corner and watched Rosalie, while she powdered and painted herself, and put on an airy summer dress, and poured out a flood of gossip about Toodles and Flossie and Grace and some others. A few minutes later came a stentorian voice in the hallway, "Second act." There were more embraces, and then Ollie brushed the powder from his coat and went away laughing. Montague stood for a few moments in the wings, watching the scene-shifters putting the final touches on the new set, and the various characters taking their positions. Then they went out to their seats. "Isn't she a jewel?" asked Oliver. "She's very pretty," the other admitted. "She came right out of the slums," said Oliver, "over on Rivington Street. That don't happen very often." "How did you come to know her?" asked his brother. "Oh, I picked her out. She was in a chorus then. I got her first speaking part." "Did you?" said the other in surprise. "How did you do that?" "Oh, a little money," was the reply. "Money will do most anything. And I was in love with her. That's how I got her." Montague said nothing, but sat in thought. "We'll take her out to supper and make her happy," added Oliver, as the curtains started up. "She's lonesome, I guess. You see, I promised Betty I'd reform." All through that scene and the next one, Rosalie acted for them. She was so full of verve and merriment that there was quite a stir in the audience, and she got several rounds of applause. Then, when the play was over, she extricated herself from the arms of the handsome young soldier, and fled to her dressing-room, and when Oliver and Montague arrived, she was half ready for the street. They went up Broadway, and from a group of people coming out of another stage entrance, a young girl came to join them, an airy little creature with the face of a doll baby, and a big hat with a purple feather on top. This was Toodles, otherwise known as Helen Gwynne, and she took Montague's arm, and they fell in behind Oliver and his companion. Montague wondered what one said to a chorus girl on the way to supper. Afterward his brother told him that Toodles had been the wife of a real estate agent in a little town in Oklahoma, and had run away from respectability and boredom with a traveling theatrical company. Now she was tripping her part in the musical comedy which Montague had seen at Mrs. Lane's, and incidentally swearing devotion to a handsome young wine agent. She confided to Montague that she hoped the latter might see her that evening. He needed to be made jealous. The Great White Way was the name which people had given to this part of Broadway, and at the head of it stood a huge hotel with flaming lights and gorgeous marble and bronze, and famous paintings upon the walls and ceilings inside. At this hour every one of its many dining rooms was thronged with supper parties, and the place rang with laughter and the rattle of dishes and the strains of several orchestras which toiled heroically in the midst of the uproar. Here they found a table, and while Ollie was ordering frozen poached eggs and quails in aspic, Montague sat and gazed about him at the revelry, and listened to the prattle of the little ex-sempstress from Riverton Street. His brother had got her, he said, by buying a speaking part in a play for her, and Montague recalled the orgies of which he had heard at the bachelors' dinner, and divined that here he was at the source of the stream from which they were fed. At the table next to them was a young Hebrew, whom Toodles pointed out as the son and heir of a great clothing manufacturer. He was keeping several girls, said she, and the queenly creature who was his vis-à-vis was one of the chorus in the Maids of Mandalay. And a little way further down the room was a boy with the face of an angel and the air of a prince of the blood. He had inherited $1,000,000 and run away from school, and was making a name for himself in the Tenderloin. The pretty little girl, all in green, who was with him, was Violet Payne, who was the artist's model in a new play that had made a hit. She had had a full-page picture of herself in the Sunday supplement of the sporting paper, which was read here, so Rosalie remarked. "Why don't you ever do that for me?" she added to Oliver. "Perhaps I will," said he with a laugh. "What does it cost?" And when he learned that the honor could be purchased for only $1,500, he said, "I'll do it if you'll be good." And from that time on, the last trace of worriment vanished from the face and conversation of Rosalie. As the champagne cocktails disappeared, she and Oliver became confidential. Then Montague turned to Toodles, to learn more about how the second generation was preying upon the women of the stage. "A chorus girl got from $10 to $20 a week," said Toodles, "and that was hardly enough to pay for her clothes. Her work was very uncertain. She would spend weeks at rehearsals, and then, if the play failed, she would get nothing. It was a dog's life, and the keys of freedom and opportunity were in the keeping of rich men, who haunted the theatres and laid siege to the girls. They would send in notes to them, or fling bouquets to them, with cards or perhaps money hidden in them. There were millionaire artists and bohemians who kept a standing order for seats in the front rows at opening performances. They had accounts with florists and liverymen and confectioners, and gave carte blanche to scores of girls who lent themselves to their purposes. Sometimes they were in league with the managers, and a girl who held back would find her chances imperiled. Sometimes these men would even finance shows to give a chance to some favorite. Afterward, Toodles turned to listen to Oliver and his companion, and Montague sat back and gazed about the room. Next to him was a long table with a dozen people at it, and he watched the buckets of champagne and the endless succession of fantastic-looking dishes of food, and the revellers with their flushed faces and feverish eyes and loud laughter. Above all the tumult was the voice of the orchestra, calling, calling, like the storm wind upon the mountains. The music was wild and chaotic, and produced an indescribable sense of pain and confusion. When one realized that this same thing was going on in thousands of places in this district, it seemed that here was a flood of dissipation that outrivaled even that of society. It was said that the hotels of New York, placed end to end, would reach all the way to London, and they took care of a couple of 100,000 people a day, a horde which had come from all over the world in search of pleasure and excitement. There were sightseers and country customers from 45 states, ranchers from Texas, and lumber kings from Maine, and mining men from Nevada. At home they had reputations and perhaps families to consider, but once plunged into the whirlpool of the Tenderloin, they were hidden from all the world. They came with their pockets full of money, and hotels and restaurants, gambling places and pool rooms and brothels, all were lying in wait for them. So eager had the competition become that there was a tailoring establishment and a bank that were never closed the year round except on Sunday. Everywhere about one's feet the nets of vice were spread. The head waiter in one's hotel was a steerer for a dive, and the house detective was touting for a gambling place. The handsome women who smiled at one in Peacock Alley was a madam. The pleasant-faced young man who spoke to one at the bar was on the lookout for customers for a brokerage house next door. 3 times in a single day in another one of these great cannavasories Montague was offered short change, and so his eyes were opened to a new kind of plundering. He was struck by the number of attendants in livery who swarmed about him, and to whom he gave tips for their services. He did not notice that the boys in the washrooms and coat rooms could not speak a word of English. He could not know that they were searched every night, and had everything taken from them, and that the Greek who hired them had paid $15,000 a year to the hotel for the privilege. So far had the specialization in evil proceeded that there were places of prostitution which did a telephone business exclusively, and would send a woman in a cab to any address. And there were high-class assignation houses which furnished exquisite apartments and the services of maids and valets. And in this world of vice, the modern doctrine of the equality of the sexes was fully recognized. There were gambling houses and pool rooms and opium joints for women, and drinking places which catered especially for them. In the orange room of one of the big hotels you might see rich women of every rank and type, fingering the dainty leather-bound and gold-embossed wine cards. In this room alone were sold over 10,000 drinks every day, and the hotel paid a rental of $1 million a year to the Devon estate. Not far away the Devons also owned the negro dives, where in the early hours of the morning you might see richly gowned white women drinking. In the seething cauldron of graft there were many strange ways of making money, and many strange and incredible types of human beings to be met. Once in society Montague had pointed out to him a woman who had been a tattooed lady in a circus. There was another who had been a confederate of gamblers upon the ocean steamships, and another who had washed dishes in a mining camp. There was one of these great hotels whose proprietor had been a successful burglar, and a department store whose owner had begun life as a fence. In any crowd of these revelers you might have such strange creatures pointed out to you: a multi-millionaire who sold rotten jam to the people, another who had invented opium, soothing syrup for babies, a convivial old gentleman who dispersed the yellow dog fund of several railroads, a handsome chauffeur who had run away with an heiress. Once a great scientist had invented a new kind of underwear, and had endeavored to make it a gift to humanity, and here was a man who had seized upon it and made millions out of it. Here was a trance medium who had got a fortune out of an imbecile old manufacturer, and here was a great newspaper proprietor who published advertisements for assignations at $1 a line, and here was a cigar manufacturer whose smug face was upon every billboard. He had begun as a tin manufacturer, and to avoid the duty he had had his raw materials cast in the form of statues and brought them in as works of art. and terrible and vile as were the sources from which these fortunes had been derived, there were no viler nor more terrible than the purposes for which they had been spent. Mrs. Vivie Patton had hinted to Montague of a Decameron Club, whose members gathered in each other's homes and vied in the telling of obscene stories. Strathcona had told him about another set of exquisite ladies and gentlemen who gave elaborate entertainments in which they dressed in the costumes of bygone periods, and imitated famous characters in history, and the vices and orgies of courts and camps. One heard of Cleopatra nights on board of yachts at Newport. There was a certain Wall Street plunger who had begun life as a mining man in the West, and when his customers came in town, he would hire a trolley car and take a load of champagne and half a dozen prostitutes and spend the night careering about the country. This man was now quartered in one of the great hotels in New York, and in his apartments he would have prize fights and chicken fights and bloodthirsty exhibitions called purring matches, in which men tried to bark each other's shins, or perhaps a battle royal with a diamond scarf pin dangling from the ceiling, and half a dozen negroes in a free-for-all fight for the prize. No picture of the ways of the Metropolis would be complete which did not force upon the reluctant reader some realization of the extent to which new and hideous incitements to vice were spreading. To say that among the leisured classes such practices were raging like a pestilence would be no exaggeration. 10 years ago they were regarded with aversion by even the professionally vicious, but now the commonest prostitute accepted them as part of her fate, and there was no height to which they had not reached. Ministers of state were enslaved by them. Great fortunes and public events were controlled by them. In Washington there had been an ambassador whose natural daughter taught them in the houses of the great, until the scandal forced the minister's recall. Some of these practices were terrible in their effects, completely wrecking the victim in a short time, and physicians who studied their symptoms would be horrified to see them appearing in the homes of their friends. And from New York, the center of the wealth and culture of the country, these vices spread to every corner of it. Theatrical companies and traveling salesmen carried them. Visiting merchants and sightseers acquired them. Pack peddlers sold vile pictures and books, the manufacturing or importing of which was now quite an industry. One might read catalogues printed abroad in English, the contents of which would make one's flesh creep. There were cheap weeklies costing 10 cents a year, which were thrust into area windows for servant girls. There were yellow-covered French novels of unbelievable depravity for the mistress of the house. It was a curious commentary upon the morals of society that upon the trains running to a certain suburban community frequented by the ultra-fashionable, the newsboys did a thriving business in such literature, and when the pastor of a fashionable church eloped with a society girl, the bishop publicly laid blame to the morals of his parishioners. The theory was that there were two worlds, and that they were kept rigidly separate. There were two sets of women, one to be toyed with and flung aside, and the other to be protected and esteemed. Such things as prostitutes and kept women might exist, but people of refinement did not talk about them, and were not concerned with them. But Montague was familiar with the saying that if you follow the chain of the slave, you will find the other end about the wrist of the master, and he discovered that the Tenderloin was wreaking its vengeance upon Fifth Avenue. It was not merely that the men of wealth were carrying to their wives and children the diseases of vice, they were carrying also the manners and the ideals. Montague had been amazed by the things he had found in New York society, the smoking and drinking and gambling of women, their hard and cynical views of life, their continual telling of coarse stories. And here in this underworld He had come upon the fountainhead of the corruption. It was something which came to him in a sudden flash of intuition. The barriers between the two worlds were breaking down. He could picture the process in 100 different forms. There was Betty Wyman. His brother had meant to take her to the theatre to let her see Rosalie by way of a joke. So of course Betty knew of his escapades, and of those of his set. She and her girlfriends were whispering and jesting about them. Here sat Oliver, smiling and cynical, toying with Rosalie as a cat might toy with a mouse. And tomorrow he would be with Betty, and could anyone doubt any longer whence Betty had derived her attitudes toward life, and the habits of mind that Oliver had taught her as a girl she would not forget as a wife. He might be anxious to keep her to himself, but there would be others whose interest was different. And Montague recalled other things that he had seen or heard in society, that he could put his finger upon as having come out of this underworld. The more he thought of the explanation, the more it seemed to explain. This society which had perplexed him, now he could describe. Its manners and ideals of life were those which he would have expected to find in the fast side of stage life. It was, of course, the women who made society and gave it its tone. The women of society were actresses. They were actresses in their love of notoriety and display, in their taste in clothes and jewels, in their fondness for cigarettes and champagne. They made up like actresses. They talked and thought like actresses. The only obvious difference was that the women of the stage were carefully selected, and were at least up to a certain standard of physical excellence, whereas the women of society were not selected at all, and some were lean, and some were stout, and some were painfully homely. Montague recalled cases where the two sets had met at some of the private entertainments. It was getting to be the fashion to hobnob with the stage people on such occasions, and he recalled how naturally the younger people took to this. Only the older women held aloof, looking down upon the women of the stage from an ineffable height as belonging to a lower caste, because they were obliged to work for their living. But it seemed to Montague, as he sat and talked with this poor chorus girl, who had sold herself for a little pleasure, that it was easier to pardon her than the woman who had been born to luxury and scorned those who produced her wealth. But most of all, one's sympathies went out to a person who was not to be met in either of these sets, the girl who had not sold herself, but was struggling for a living in the midst of this ravening corruption. There were thousands of self-respecting women, even on the stage. Toodles herself had been among them, she told Montague. "I kept straight for a long time," she said, laughing cheerfully, "and on $10 a week. I used to go out on the road, and they paid me 16. And think of trying to live on one-night stands, to board yourself and stop at hotels and dress for the theatre, on 16 a week, and no job half the year. And all that time, do you know Cyril Chambers, the famous church painter?" "I've heard of him," said Montague. "Well, I was with a show here on Broadway the next winter, and every night for 6 months he sent me a bunch of orchids that couldn't have cost less than $75. And he told me he had opened an account for me in all the stores I chose, if I'd spend next summer in Europe with him. He said I could take my mother or my sister with me, and I was so green in those days I thought that must mean he didn't intend anything wrong." Toodles smiled at the memory. "Did you go?" asked the man. "No," she answered. "I stayed here with a roof garden show that failed, and I went to my old manager for a job, and he said to me, 'I can only pay you 10 a week, but why are you so foolish?'" "How do you mean?" I asked, and he answered, "Why don't you get a rich sweetheart? Then I could pay you 60. That's what a girl hears on the stage." "I don't understand," said Montague, perplexed. Did he mean he could get money out of the man? "Not directly," said Toodles, "but tickets and advertising. Why, men will hire front row seats for a whole season if they're interested in a girl in the show. And they'll take all their friends to see her, and she'll be talked about, and she'll be somebody, instead of just nobody as I was." "Then it actually helps her on the stage," said Montague. "Helps her!" exclaimed Toodles. "My God, I've known a girl who's been abroad with a tip-top swell, and had the gowns and the jewels to prove it, to come home and get into the front row of a chorus at $100 a week." Toodles was cheerful and all unaware, and that only made the tragedy of it all one shade more black to Montague. He sat lost in sombre reverie, forgetting his companions and the blare and glare of the place. In the centre of this dining room was a great cone-shaped stand, containing a display of food, and as they strolled out, Montague stopped to look at it. There were platters garnished with flowers and herbs, and containing roast turkeys and baked hams, jellied meats and game in aspic, puddings and tarts and frosted cakes, every kind of food fantastically imaginable. One might have spent an hour in studying it, and from top to bottom he would have found nothing simple, nothing natural. The turkeys had paper curls and rosettes stuck over them. The hams were covered with a white gelatine, the devilled crabs with a yellow mayonnaise, and all were painted over in pink and green and black with landscapes and marine views, with ships and shoes and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. The jellied meats and the puddings were in the shape of fruits and flowers, and there were elaborate works of art in pink and white confectionery, a barnyard, for instance, with horses and cows, and a pump, and a dairymaid, and one or two alligators. All this was changed every day. Every morning you might see a procession of a score of waiters bearing aloft a new supply. Montague remembered Betty Wynn's remark at their first interview, apropos of the whipped cream made into little curlicues, and how his brother had said, if Allan were here, he'd be thinking about the man who fixed that cream, and how long it took him, and how he might have been reading The Simple Life. He thought of that now. He stood and gazed and wondered about all the slaves of the lamp who served in this huge temple of luxury. He looked at the waiters, pale, hollow-chested, harried-looking men. He imagined the hordes of servants of yet lower kinds, who never emerged into the light of day, the men who washed the dishes, the men who carried the garbage, the men who shovelled the coal into the furnaces, and made the heat and light and power, pent up in dim cellars, many stories underground, and bound for ever to the service of sensuality. How terrible must be their fate, how unimaginable their corruption! And they were foreigners. They had come here seeking liberty, and the masters of the new country had seized them and pent them here. From this as a starting point, his thought went on, to the hordes of toilers in every part of the world, whose fate it was to create the things which these blind revellers destroyed, the women and children in countless mills and sweatshops, who spun the cloth and cut and sewed it, the girls who made the artificial flowers, who rolled the cigarettes and who gathered the grapes from the vines, the miners who dug the coal and the precious metals out of the earth, the men who watched in 10,000 signal towers and engines, who fought the elements from the decks of 10,000 ships, to bring all these things here to be destroyed. Step by step, as the flood of extravagance rose, and the energies of the men were turned to the creation of futility and corruption, so step by step increased the misery and degradation of all these slaves of Mammon. And who could imagine what they would think about, if ever they came to think? And then, in a sudden flash, there came back to Montague that speech he had heard upon the street corner, the first evening he had been in New York. He could hear again the pounding of the elevated trains, and the shrill voice of the orator. He could see his haggard and hungry face, and the dense crowd gazing up at him. And there came to him the words of Major Thorne. "It means another civil war." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Alice had been gone for a couple of weeks, and the day was drawing near when the Hasbrook case came up for trial. The Saturday before that being the date of the Mi Carême dance at the Long Island Hunt Club, Siegfried Harvey was to have a house party for the weekend, and Montague accepted his invitation. He had been working hard, putting the finishing touches to his brief, and he thought that a rest would be good for him. He and his brother went down upon Friday afternoon, and the first person he met was Betty Wyman, who he had not seen for quite a while. Betty had much to say, and said it. As Montague had not been seen with Mrs. Winnie since the episode in her house, people had begun to notice the break, and there was no end of gossip, and Mistress Betty wanted to know all about it, and how things stood between them. But he would not tell her, and so she saucily refused to tell him what she had heard. All the while they talked, she was eyeing him quizzically, and it was evident that she took the worst for granted, also that he had become a much more interesting person to her because of it. Montague had the strangest sensations when he was talking with Betty Wyman. She was delicious and appealing, almost irresistible, and yet her views of life were so old. "I told you you wouldn't do for a tame cat," she said to him. Then she went on to talk to him about his case, and to tease him about the disturbance he had made. "You know," she said, "Ollie and I were in a terror. We thought that grandfather would be furious, and that we'd be ruined. But somehow it didn't work out that way. Don't you say anything about it, but I've had sort of a fancy that he must be on your side of the fence." "I am glad to know it," said Montague with a laugh. "I've been trying for a long time to find out who is on my side of the fence." "He was talking about it the other day," said Betty, "and I heard him tell a man that he had read your argument, and thought it was good." "I am glad to hear that," said Montague. "So was I," replied she, "and I said to him afterward, 'I suppose you don't know that Allan Montague is my Ollie's brother.' And he did you the honour to say that he hadn't supposed any member of Ollie's family could have as much sense." Betty was staying with Aunt near by, and she went back before dinner. In the automobile which came for her was old Wyman himself, on his way home from the city, and as a snowstorm had begun, he came in and stood by the fire while his car was exchanged for a closed one from Harvey's stables. Montague did not meet him, but stood and watched him from the shadows, a mite of a man, with a keen and eager face full of wrinkles. It was hard to realize that this little body held one of the great driving minds of the country. He was an intensely nervous and irritable man, bitter and implacable, by all odds the most hated and feared man in Wall Street. He was swift, imperious, savage as a hornet. "Directors at meetings that I attend vote first and discuss afterwards," was one of his sayings that Montague had heard quoted. Watching him here by the fireside, rubbing his hands and chatting pleasantly, Montague had a sudden sense of being behind the scenes, of being admitted to a privilege denied to ordinary mortals, the beholding of royalty in everyday attire. After dinner that evening Montague had a chat in the smoking-room with his host, and he brought up the subject of the Hasbrook case, and told about his trip to Washington and his interview with Judge Ellis. Harvey also had something to communicate. "I had a talk with Freddie Van Dam about it," said he. "What did he say?" asked Montague. "Well," replied the other with a laugh, "he's indignant. Needless to say, you know, Freddie was brought up by his father to regard the Fidelity as his property, in a way. He always refers to it as my company, and he's very high and mighty about it. It's a personal affront if anyone attacks it. But it was evident to me that he doesn't know who's behind this case." "Did he know about Ellis?" asked Montague. "Yes," said the other. "He had found out that much. It was he who told me that originally. He says that Ellis has been sponging off the company for years. He has a big salary that he never earns, and has borrowed something like $250,000 on worthless securities." Montague gave a gasp. "Yes," laughed Harvey, "but after all, that's a little matter. The trouble with Freddie Vandam is that sort of thing is all he sees, and so he'll never be able to make out the mystery. He knows that this clique or that in the company is plotting to get some advantage, or to use him for their purposes. But he never realizes how the big men are pulling the wires behind the scenes. Some day they'll throw him overboard altogether. And then he'll realize how they've played with him. That's what this Hasbrook case means, you know. They simply want to frighten him with the threat of getting the company's affairs into the courts and the newspapers." Montague sat for a while in deep thought. "What would you think would be Wyman's relation to the matter?" he asked at last. "I wouldn't know," said Harvey. "He's supposed to be Freddie's backer. But what can you tell in such a tangle?" "It is certainly a mess," said Montague. "There's no bottom to it," said the other. "Absolutely. It would take your breath away. Just listen to what Vandam told me today." And then Harvey named one of the directors of the Fidelity, who was well known as a philanthropist. Having heard that the wife of one of his junior partners had met with an accident in childbirth, and that the doctor had told her husband that if she ever had another child she would die, this man asked, "Why don't you have her life insured?" The other replied that he had tried, and the companies had refused her. "I'll fix it for you," said he, and so they put in another application, and the director came to Freddie Vandam and had the policy put through by executive order. 7 months later the woman died, and Fidelity had paid her husband in full, 100,000 or two. "That's what's going on in the insurance world," said Siegfried Harvey. And that was the story which Montague took with him to add to the enjoyment of the festivities at the country club. It was a very gorgeous affair, but perhaps the somberness of his thoughts was to blame. The flowers and music and beautiful gowns failed entirely in their appeal, and he saw only the gluttony and drunkenness, more of it than ever before, it seemed to him. Then, too, he had an unpleasant experience. He met Laura Hegan, and presuming upon her cordial reception of his visit, he went up and spoke to her pleasantly. And she greeted him with frigid politeness. She was so brief in her remarks, and turned away so abruptly, as almost to snub him. He went away quite bewildered, but later on he recalled the gossip about himself and Mrs. Winnie, and he guessed that that was the explanation of Miss Hagan's action. The episode threw a shadow over his whole visit. On Sunday he went out into the country and tramped through a snowstorm by himself, filled with a sense of disgust for all the past, and of foreboding for the future. He hated this money world, in which all that was worst in human beings was brought to the surface. He hated it, and wished he had never set foot within its bounds. It was only by tramping until he was too tired to feel anything that he was able to master himself. And then toward dark he came back, and found a telegram which had been forwarded from New York. "Meet me at the Penna Depot, Jersey City, at 9 tonight. Alice." This message, of course, drove all other thoughts from his mind. He had no time even to tell Oliver about it. He had to jump into an automobile and rush to catch the next train for the city. And all through the long, cold ride in ferry boats and cabs, he pondered this mystery. Alice's party had not been expected for 2 weeks yet, and only 2 days before there had come a letter from Los Angeles saying that they would probably be a week overtime. And here she was, home again.
he found there was an express from the west due at the hour named. Apparently, therefore, Alice had not come in the Prentice's train at all. The express was half an hour late, and so he paced up and down the platform, controlling his impatience as best he could, and finally the long train pulled in, and he saw Alice coming down the platform. She was alone. "What does it mean?" were the first words he said to her. "It's a long story," she answered. "I wanted to come home." "You mean you've come all the way from the coast by yourself?" he gasped. "Yes," she said, "all the way." "What in the world—" he began. "I can't tell you here, Allan," she said. "Wait till we get to some quiet place." "But," he persisted, "the Prentice, they let you come home alone?" "They didn't know it," she said. "I ran away." He was more bewildered than ever, but as he started to ask more questions, she laid a hand upon his arm. "Please wait, Allan," she said. "It upsets me to talk about it. It was Charlie Carter." And so the light broke. He caught his breath and gasped, "Oh!" He said not another word until they had crossed the ferry and settled themselves in a cab, and started. "Now," he said, "tell me." Alice began. "I was very much upset," she said. "But you must understand, Allan, that I've had nearly a week to think it over, and I don't mind it now. So I want you please not to get excited about it. It wasn't poor Charlie's fault. He can't help himself. It was my mistake. I ought to have taken your advice and had nothing to do with him." "Go on," said he, and Alice told her story. The party had gone sight-seeing, and she had had a headache and stayed in the car. And Charlie Carter had come and begun to make love to her. He had asked me to marry him already. That was at the beginning of the trip, she said, and I told him no. After that he would never let me alone. And this time he went on in a terrible way. He flung himself down on his knees and wept, and said he couldn't live without me. And nothing I could say did any good. At last he caught hold of me, and he wouldn't let me go. I was furious with him and frightened. I had to threaten to call for help before he would stop. And so you see how it was." "I see," said Montague gravely. "Go on." "Well, after that I made up my mind that I couldn't stay anywhere where I had to see him. And I knew he would never go away without a scene. If I had asked Mrs. Prentice to send him away, there would have been a scandal, and it would have spoiled everybody's trip. So I went out and found there was a train for the East in a little while, and I packed up my things and left a note for Mrs. Prentice. I told her a story. I said I'd had a telegram that your mother was ill, and that I didn't want to spoil their good time, and had gone by myself. That was the best thing I could think of. I wasn't afraid to travel, so long as I was sure that Charlie couldn't catch up with me." Montague said nothing. He sat with his hands gripped tightly. "It seemed like a desperate thing to do," said Alice nervously. "But you see, I was upset and unhappy. I didn't seem to like the party any more. I wanted to be home. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Montague, "I understand, and I'm glad you are here." They reached home, and Montague called up Harvey's and told his brother what had happened. He could hear Oliver gasp with astonishment. "That's a pretty how do you do," he said, when he had got his breath back, and then he added with a laugh, "I suppose that settles poor Charlie's chances." "I'm glad you've come to that conclusion," said the other, as he hung up the receiver. This episode gave Montague quite a shock, but he had little time to think about it. The next morning at 11 o'clock his case was to come up for trial, and so all his thoughts were called away. This case had been the one real interest of his life for the last 3 months. It was his purpose, the thing for the sake of which he endured everything else that repelled him. And he had trained himself as an athlete for a great race. He was in form, and ready for the effort of his life. He went downtown that morning with every fiber of him, body and mind, alert and eager. And he went into his office, and in his mail was a letter
from Mr. Hasbrook. He opened it hastily and read a message, brief, direct, and decisive as a sword thrust. "I beg to inform you that I have received a satisfactory proposition from the Fidelity Company. I have settled with them, and wish to withdraw the suit. Thanking you for your services, I remain, sincerely—" To Montague this thing came like a thunderbolt. He sat utterly dumbfounded. His hands went limp, and the letter fell upon the desk in front of him. And at last, when he did move, he picked up the telephone and told his secretary to call up Mr. Hasbrook. Then he sat waiting, and when the bell rang, picked up the receiver, expecting to hear Mr. Hasbrook's voice and to demand an explanation. But he heard instead the voice of his own secretary. "Central says the number's been discontinued, sir." And he hung up the receiver and sat motionless again. The dummy had disappeared. To Montague this incident meant a change in the prospects of his whole life. It was the collapse of all his hopes. He had nothing more to work for, nothing more to think about. The bottom had fallen out of his career. He was burning with a sense of outrage. He had been tricked and made a fool of. He had been used and flung aside. And now there was nothing he could do. He was utterly helpless. What affected him most was a sense of the overwhelming magnitude of the powers which had made him their puppet, of the utter futility of the efforts that he or any other man could make against them. They were like elemental, cosmic forces. They held all the world in their grip, and a common man was as much at their mercy as a bit of chaff in a tempest. All day long he sat in his office, brooding and nursing his wrath. He had moods when he wished to drop everything, to shake the dust of the city from his feet, and go back home and recollect what it was to be a gentleman. And then again he had fighting moods, when he wished to devote all his life to punishing the men who had made use of him. He would get hold of some other policy-holder in the Fidelity, one whom he could trust. He would take the case without pay and carry it through to the end. He would force the newspapers to talk about it. He would force the people to heed what he said. And then towards evening he went home, bitter and sore, and there was his brother sitting in his study waiting for him. "Hello," he said, and took off his coat, preparing his mind for one more ignominy, the telling of his misfortune to Oliver, and listening to his inevitable "I told you so." But Oliver himself had something to communicate, something that would not bear keeping. He broke out at once. "Tell me, Allan, what in the world has happened between you and Mrs. Winnie?" "What do you mean?" asked Montague sharply. "Why," said Oliver, "everybody is talking about some kind of quarrel." "There's been no quarrel," said Montague. "Well, what is it, then?" "It's nothing." "It must be something," exclaimed Oliver. "What do all the stories mean?" "What stories?" "About you two. I met Mrs. Vivie Patton just now, and she swore me to secrecy, and told me that Mrs. Winnie had told someone that you had made love to her so outrageously that she had to ask you to leave the house." Montague shrunk as from a blow. "Oh!" he gasped. "That's what she said," said he. "It's a lie!" he cried. "That's what I told Mrs. Vivie," said the other. "It doesn't sound like you." Montague had flushed scarlet. "I don't mean that," he cried. "I mean that Mrs. Winnie never said any such thing." "Oh," said Oliver, and he shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe not," he added. "But I know she's furious with you about something. Everybody's talking about it. She tells people that she'll never speak to you again. And what I want to know is, why is it that you have to do things to make enemies of everybody you know?" Montague said nothing. He was trembling with anger. "What in the world did you do to her?" began the other. "Can't you trust me?" And suddenly Montague sprang to his feet. "Oh, Oliver!" he exclaimed. "Let me alone! Go away!" And he went into the next room and slammed the door, and began pacing back and forth like a caged animal. It was a lie! It was a lie! Mrs. Winnie had never said such a thing. He would never believe it. It was a nasty piece of backstairs gossip. But then a new burst of rage swept over him. What did it matter whether it was true or not? Whether anything was true or not? What did it matter if anybody had done all the hideous and loathsome things that everybody else said they had done? It was what everybody was saying. It was what everybody believed, what everybody was interested in. It was the measure of a whole society, their ideas and their standards. It was the way they spent their time, repeating nasty scandals about each other, living in an atmosphere of suspicion and cynicism, an endless whispering and leering and gossiping of lewd intrigue. A flood of rage surged up within him and swept him away. Rage against the world into which he had come, and against himself for the part he had played in it. Everything seemed to have come to a head at once. He hated everything, hated the people he had met, and the things they did, and the things they had tempted him to do. He hated the way he had got his money, and the way he had spent it. He hated the idleness and wastefulness, and drunkenness and debauchery, the meanness and the snobbishness. And suddenly he turned and flung open the door of the room where Oliver still sat. And he stood in the doorway, exclaiming, "Oliver, I'm done with it." Oliver stared at him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean," cried his brother, "that I've had all I can stand of society, and I'm going to quit. You can go on, but I don't intend to take another step with you. I've had enough, and I think Alice has had enough also. We'll take ourselves off your hands. We'll get out." "What are you going to do?" gasped Oliver. "I'm going to give up these expensive apartments, give them up tomorrow when our week is up. And I'm going to stop squandering money for things I don't want. And I'm going to stop accepting invitations and meeting people I don't like and don't want to know. I've tried your game. I've tried it hard. And I don't like it. And I'm going to get out before it's too late. I'm going to find some decent and simple place to live in. And I'm going downtown to find out if there isn't some way in New York for a man to earn an honest living. End of chapter 21. End of The Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. Recording by Richard Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas.